Sign it and get out of my life." Derek Whitmore slammed the divorce papers across the conference table so violently the water glasses shook. His attorney flinched. The paralegal near the window stopped breathing. Derek leaned forward, voice dropping to something colder than a shout, a controlled, deliberate cruelty. "You built nothing, you are nothing. Sign it." Claire Whitmore looked at the man who had stolen 11 years of her mind, her labor and her identity, and picked up the pen. She signed away the mansion, the company, every share of the empire she had quietly built for him. Derek laughed out loud. He had no idea she had already destroyed him. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and follow Claire's journey all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The pen barely made a sound when it touched the paper. But in that conference room on the 41st floor of the Whitmore Development Building, that soft scratch against the signature line was the loudest thing Claire Whitmore had heard in 11 years. She pressed down, she signed, and Derek Whitmore, her husband, the man whose company had been rebuilt on the foundation of her thinking, her labor, and 11 years of her life, leaned back in his leather chair and exhaled like a man who had just finished a very long and irritating task. And finally he said, not to himself, to the room. To Howard Pike, his silver-haired attorney who was already beginning to stack documents. To the paralegal near the window who was pretending not to listen. To Claire herself. Just finally, Claire set the pen down without a word. Her attorney, Rachel Mann, sat directly to her left, and Rachel's jaw was tight in a way that meant she was biting an entire paragraph. Rachel had spent 3 weeks preparing arguments about Claire's contributions to Whitmore Development. She had gathered financial records, evaluated property portfolios, consulted 2 separate forensic accountants who had concluded that without Claire's behind-the-scenes analytical work, the company likely would not have survived its first recession. 3 weeks of preparation, and Claire had spent 20 minutes that morning telling her not to use any of it. Rachel, Derek's attorney, said pleasantly, beginning to gather his copies, "You should be proud of your client. This is one of the more sensible divorce resolutions I've seen in 15 years of practice." Rachel didn't answer him. She was looking at Claire with an expression somewhere between grief and bewilderment. Claire, her voice was low, measured the voice of a woman who was choosing each word like a person, crossing a frozen lake step at a time. "Before we finalize, I need to ask you one more time. You are walking away from a company whose value our analysts conservatively place at $60 to $80 million. You helped build that. You have 11 years of documented contribution that, Rachel, a judge would consider extremely relevant to Rachel." Claire's voice was quiet, but it stopped the room, not because it was loud, because it was certain. "I know what I'm doing." Rachel studied her for a long moment. Then she closed her folder. Derek was watching this exchange with visible enjoyment. He had always enjoyed watching Claire manage difficult conversations back when she was managing them for his benefit. Now he simply watched with the relaxed satisfaction of a man who had already decided how the story ended. "So that's it?" Derek asked, addressing Claire directly for what felt like the first time all morning. "No speech, no list of grievances. I was prepared for a much longer morning." Claire looked at him. 11 years looked back at her, the sleepless nights over financial models, the supplier negotiations she had conducted while he was photographed at industry events, the bank meetings where she had prepared every number he read from notes she'd written. The recession year when Whitmore Development had been 3 months from collapse, and she had sat at their kitchen for 70 consecutive hours restructuring his debt load, until she found offer architecture that saved everything. She looked at all of that and she said no speech. "Derek," she picked up her purse, "just goodbye." She walked toward the door. Behind her, she heard Howard Pike begin congratulating Derek on the clean resolution. She heard Derek say something she couldn't quite make out, followed by the low sound of male laughter. She kept walking. The elevator doors opened. She stepped inside. She pressed the lobby button. The doors slid closed, and the moment they did, the composed expression Claire had maintained for 3 hours in that conference room changed for exactly 6 seconds. Her chin dropped, her hand pressed flat against the elevator wall. She breathed 6 seconds. Then the doors opened into the lobby, and Claire Whitmore straightened her spine, walked across the marble floor, pushed through the glass doors into the cold November air, and did not look back at the building behind her. 3 days later, she was sitting inside a room that smelled like industrial cleaner and old carpet. The extended stay apartment was on the east side of Charlotte, the kind of place that catered to traveling contractors and people between situations. The furniture was bolted down in some places. The bathroom tiles had grout lines that no amount of scrubbing would ever fully restore. Claire sat cross-legged on the bed with an old laptop balanced on her knees, a lukewarm coffee on the nightstand, and a yellow legal pad covered in notes beside her. Her phone had 43 unread messages. She had read none of them. Most were from people who had heard about the divorce. Some expressed sympathy. Several were from friends who were clearly reaching out because they wanted details more than they wanted to offer comfort. 3 were from reporters. 1 was from Derek's mother, which Claire set aside because she genuinely did not have the emotional bandwidth to open it. And 1 was from a number she recognized immediately. Professor Malcolm Reeves. She opened that one. Malcolm Reeves had been her graduate school advisor for 2 years, a man who had told her during her first semester that she had one of the sharpest analytical minds he had encountered in a decade of teaching, and who had watched her graduate near the top of her class with an expression of pure professional satisfaction. He had also been at her wedding. He had watched over 11 years as the field she had been so brilliantly positioned to enter receded further and further from her actual life. His message was short, I heard. Call me when you're ready. Malcolm, she called him that evening. He answered on the second ring. I wasn't sure if you'd call tonight or in 2 months, he said. Skipping hello entirely, I almost waited 2 months, she admitted. Are you all right? She looked around the room, the industrial carpet, the bolted-down dresser, the window with its partial view of a parking structure. I will be, she said. I need to work. Malcolm was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone searching for something to say, but the silence of a man who was thinking carefully about what to offer. I want to help, he said finally. But Claire, what you're describing isn't a gap you fill with a teaching position or a consulting role. You have 11 years of real applied financial work that no resume can capture on paper. What you need is someone who already understands what that means. Someone who can put you in a position where you prove yourself by doing the work instead of explaining it. Do you know someone like that? Another pause. I know someone who doesn't care about resumes at all, Malcolm said, which in your situation might be the same thing. He gave her a name. Alexander Kane. Claire had heard the name. Most people in the financial world had. Alexander Kane had built Kane Capital Partners over 20 years from a single distressed asset purchase into one of the most feared and respected investment firms in the Southeast. He was known for 3 things: extraordinary returns, absolute intolerance for mediocrity, and a reputation for either transforming the people who worked for him or cutting them loose so fast they felt the wind for weeks afterward. He was not known for taking meetings with unemployed women from Charlotte, whose primary recent credential was being erased from their own husband's success story. He'll never agree to see me, Claire said. He'll see you, Malcolm said, because I'll ask him to. What happens after that is entirely yours to navigate. She was on a flight to Atlanta 48 hours later. Alexander Kane's offices occupied 3 floors of a glass tower in Midtown Atlanta. The lobby was deliberately understated, no photographs of successful deals on the walls, no framed magazine covers, no trophy cases, just clean lines, a small security desk, and the faint sound of a conversation happening somewhere out of sight. The assistant who met Claire in the lobby was polite and efficient. She was shown to a waiting area. She waited 11 minutes. Then she was taken through a hallway and into a corner office where Alexander Kane was standing with his back to the door, looking out at the city below. He was taller than she'd expected, broader shouldered. He turned when she entered, and she noticed immediately that he didn't smile. Not unfriendly, simply precise. He was a man who apparently did not deploy his expressions without reason. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. They both sat. He picked up her resume. He'd looked at it for 30 seconds. Then he set it back down. 11 years without formal employment, he said. His voice was matter-of-fact, the same tone a doctor might use reading a lab result aloud. I was working, you were married. Those aren't mutually exclusive. He looked at her then. Actually looked at her, the way someone looks at a thing they've just reconsidered. What did you do, he asked specifically. I identified undervalued properties before your competitors did. I renegotiated supplier contracts during a period when material costs were climbing 14% annually. I built the debt restructuring model that kept Whitmore Development solvent during the recession. And I designed the analysis framework that helped the company evaluate acquisition targets for the following 6 years. Did anyone know that? The company benefited from it. My husband took the credit for it, and you let that happen. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation, but it still landed somewhere uncomfortable. And Alexander Kane watched to see how she handled it. Yes, Claire said, I let that happen. For longer than I should have. Why? Because I believed that contributing to something mattered even when no one put your name on it. She paused. I no longer believe that. Alexander held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned to a file on his desk and slid it across to her. Kane Capital holds a commercial portfolio that 2 of my senior analysts have recommended liquidating. They've written a 70-page report explaining why, and you want me to read it? I want you to tell me if they're right now? You have until tomorrow morning. He stood. The meeting was over. Claire picked up the file. She walked back to her hotel. She ordered room service she barely touched, and she read every page. It took her 3 hours to find the problem. The analysts were wrong. Not about everything. They had done competent work, gathered solid data, reached a reasonable conclusion based on what they could see. But they had missed something. Buried in the portfolio's property descriptions was a footnote referencing a municipal zoning study completed 14 months earlier. The study recommended reclassifying 3 parcels currently zoned light commercial in development corridors, a change that, if implemented, would fundamentally alter what could be built on those properties. Claire verified the status of the zoning study through public county records. The reclassification had been formally adopted 11 weeks ago. The analysts had evaluated the portfolio before it went through. The value they had assigned to those 3 properties was based on what they could do under the old zoning. Under the new zoning, those 3 parcels alone were worth conservatively 2.5 times the analyst's combined figure. Claire didn't sleep. She spent the night building the model. Comparable sales under similar zoning reclassifications, current construction cost estimates, demand analysis for the relevant market. 2 sensitivity scenarios based on different timelines for development. She arrived at Alexander Kane's offices at 7:42 in the morning. He arrived at 8. He found her already seated across from his desk. He looked at the binder she had assembled. You found something, he said. Your analysts missed a zoning change. The portfolio isn't worth what they say it's worth. She opened the binder to the first analysis tab. It's worth considerably more. Alexander sat. He read. He asked 3 questions. She answered all 3. Then he closed the binder. He stood and moved a chair from against the wall to a position beside the conference table on the far side of his office. Sit down, he said. Claire moved to the chair. Alexander slid another file across the table. Let's see if that was luck. It wasn't luck. Over the next several weeks, Claire worked through 4 more evaluation projects that Alexander's team had queued. On the first, she identified a tax structure inefficiency that was creating phantom losses and recommended a restructuring that would save approximately $4 million annually. On the second, she flagged that the acquisition target was carrying undisclosed litigation risk in its subsidiary. Filings risk that the standard due diligence process had not uncovered because the subsidiary's filings were registered in a different state. On the third, she was wrong. She had evaluated a mixed-use development in Memphis and concluded the project was undervalued. Alexander's team investigated further and found she had applied an occupancy assumption that didn't account for a local employment shift that had already begun depressing rental demand in that core. Alexander called her into his office. He did not lecture her. He laid the counter-analysis on the desk, pointed to exactly where her assumption had broken down, explained why the employment shift variable had been the critical factor, and asked what she would do differently. She told him. He nodded. He gave her another file. That was the entire conversation. It was the most professionally honest exchange she had experienced in 11 years. And somewhere in those early weeks, something in Claire quietly recalibrated. The particular anxiety she had carried, the anxiety of a woman who had been made to feel that her competence was borrowed, that her contributions existed only because someone else allowed them, began to loosen. Because Alexander Kane had no interest in performing confidence on her behalf. He didn't praise her when she was right. He didn't reassure her when she doubted herself. He simply gave her work, responded to the quality of what she produced, and treated her professional conclusions as things worth arguing with, which she slowly understood was the highest form of respect she had ever received in a professional context. People at Kane Capital began noticing. A senior analyst named David Cho started sending her preliminary drafts before finalizing reports because he had found twice that she caught things his team had passed over. A project director named Linda Park started asking her opinion in meetings, not to be collegial, but because the opinion was actually useful. 6 weeks into her time at Kane Capital, Alexander called Claire into his office and slid a single document across the desk. A contract. Director of Special Situations. Her name was on it. This is a real position, he said, not a trial, not a... You'll carry full responsibilities and be evaluated accordingly. Claire looked at the contract. She thought about the conference room on the 41st floor of a building in Charlotte. She thought about a pen touching paper. She thought about a man saying finally and laughing with his attorney while she walked toward an elevator. She picked up the pen. "I accept," she said, and her hand didn't shake. But even as her professional life was rebuilding itself with a kind of clean, structural momentum, something else was developing in the shadows of Whitmore Development, something Claire had begun to see the edges of even before she had signed those divorce papers. It had started as a pattern she almost dismissed. During the final months of her marriage, when Derek's distance had made their home feel like a building she was simply maintaining rather than living in, Claire had found herself doing what she always did when she felt helpless. She analyzed, she pulled up financial documents she still had access to, tax filings, supplier contracts, internal budget summaries, and she read them the way a person reads them when they are not looking for anything specific. And she found something anyway: expenses that didn't add up, management fees paid to companies she didn't recognize, budget line items for construction projects that were running at costs significantly above comparable developments in the same market. She had told herself it was inefficiency. She had told herself Derek had simply hired less rigorous people in her absence. But the numbers bothered her. They had bothered her all the way through the divorce proceedings, through the signing, through the drive to the extended stay apartment. Now, 4 months later, sitting inside an office that had her name on the door and a salary that was entirely her own, Claire pulled up a public regulatory filing she had noticed while conducting background research on a potential Kane Capital investment. The project was called Ravenport Commons, and Whitmore Development was the primary developer. Claire knew Ravenport. Years earlier, she calculated it had been during the 3rd year of their marriage she and Derek had evaluated the land together. She had driven out past the promise on a gray Tuesday afternoon and stood in the gravel access road and told Derek what she thought it was worth and what kind of development could make it work. He had listened then. He used to listen then. Now, Ravenport Commons was listed as a commercial and mixed-use development with a reported construction budget of just under $42 million. Claire pulled up comparable projects in the same region. She did the math 3 different ways. $42 million was not a reasonable number for what Ravenport Commons was being built to be. $28 million was a reasonable number, possibly 26. The difference between 28 and 42 was $14 million. She sat with that number for a long time. Then she searched the public filings for the names of Whitmore Development's primary subcontractors on the Ravenport project. Most were companies she recognized, regional construction firms, established vendors, the kind of names that appeared in every large project in the Charlotte market. And then there was Blue Cedar Consulting LLC. Payments to Blue Cedar totaled, across multiple billing periods, approximately $18 million. $18 million to a consulting firm. For a commercial development project, Claire searched for Blue Cedar Consulting LLC. No website. No registered physical headquarters beyond a post office box in a Wilmington office services center. No employee records in any accessible database, no news mentions. No project history, no evidence of any functioning business operation whatsoever. $18 million. To a company that appeared to exist only on paper. Claire stared at that for a long time. Then she opened a new document. And she started writing down everything she knew. She didn't go to Alexander immediately. She needed to understand what she was seeing before she brought it to anyone. Because there was a version of this that was innocent, inefficient billing practices, poorly structured subcontracts, legitimate consulting work that simply wasn't visible in public filings, and she needed to rule those possibilities out before she said something she couldn't take back. She spent 3 weeks doing exactly that. She pulled every public document she could access: property record, lien file, county permit applications, state contractor licensing databases, Secretary of State business filings. Blue Cedar Consulting LLC had been registered 14 months ago. Its registered agent was a law firm that specialized in entity formation, the kind of firm you hired when you wanted to establish a company quickly with minimal visibility. Its listed manager was a name Claire didn't recognize. She searched the name. It connected to 2 other LLCs, both registered in the previous 2 years, both using the same law firm as registered agent. One of those LLCs had a second listed manager. That name Claire recognized: Calvin Mercer, Derek's chief financial officer, the man who had been with Whitmore Development for 9 years, the man who had control over the company's internal payment authorization process, the man whose office was directly adjacent to Derek's on the executive floor. Claire sat back. She looked at the ceiling. She thought about Derek smiling in that conference room. She thought about a man who believed with absolute confidence that the woman walking away from his empire was walking away because she didn't understand it. Then she picked up her phone and called Alexander Kane. "I need 30 minutes, she said when he answered. "My 4 o'clock just cleared," he said. "Come up." She went up. She laid the documents on his desk in the order she had discovered them. She walked him through every step: the inflated construction budget, Blue Cedar, the registered agent, the LLC connections, Calvin Mercer's name at the end of the chain. Alexander listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that wasn't what she expected. "Don't chase revenge," he said. "Chase proof." "I know the difference," she said. "I know you think you do." He looked at her directly. "The moment this becomes personal, you lose control of it. And you need to control it." He paused. "Is it personal?" Claire considered that honestly. "It stopped being personal," she said carefully, "the night I found Calvin Mercer's name." Alexander studied her. "All right," he said. He leaned forward. "Then let's talk about what we do next." What they did next was quiet. Kane Capital was already in early conversations about potentially financing a portion of Ravenport Commons. Alexander used that position to justify a more intensive due diligence review, the kind of review that, for a firm of Kane Capital's resources, could access more information than Derek's attorneys would ever anticipate. Kane Capital's forensic accounting team was brought in under strict confidentiality. Claire worked alongside them, not in front of them. She understood the line clearly. She was providing context and analysis. The forensic team was conducting the formal investigation. Everything they found through public records, independent verification, and legitimate financial channels was their work, not hers. But she was there for every conversation, and what they found over the following 3 weeks was worse than she had initially understood. The inflated invoices were not isolated to Ravenport. Blue Cedar had received payments from at least 4 other Whitmore development projects over the previous 3 years. The total across all projects was not $18 million. It was closer to $31 million. The money had moved through Blue Cedar into one of the connected LLCs, then into a trust, Calvin Mercer's Family Trust, a trust that had, among other things, the purchase of a vacation property in the Outer Banks and several significant investment accounts. But here was the piece that changed everything. The forensic team found evidence suggesting that the inflated costs were not simply being used to siphon money out of the company. They were also being used to support artificially elevated valuations submitted to lenders. Whitmore Development had secured approximately $94 million in new construction financing over the previous 3 years, in part based on financial statements that included those inflated expense figures as evidence of significant project activity. If lenders had known the true cost structure, several of those loans likely would not have been approved at the sizes they were. Claire read the summary document the forensic team produced. She thought about Derek in that conference room, sliding papers across a table, saying finally. She thought about the long, patient years she had spent in the background of a company she'd helped create, watching someone else take credit for thinking she had done. She did not feel triumph. She felt something colder and more deliberate than triumph. She felt resolved. She brought the full summary to Alexander. He read it. He made 3 calls. The first was to Kane Capital's legal team. The second was to an independent counsel specializing in financial fraud matters to ensure that whatever evidence had been gathered was handled properly and could be made available to the appropriate authorities through appropriate legal channels. The third call was to the lead lender on the Ravenport project, with whom Alexander had a long-standing professional relationship, to indicate that Kane Capital was withdrawing from the financing consideration. He did not explain why. He didn't need to. In financial, when Alexander Kane quietly withdrew from a deal without explanation, people paid attention. Derek noticed within 48 hours. Claire was in her office reviewing a separate project file when her phone lit up with an unknown Charlotte number. She looked at it for 3 rings. Then she answered. "What did you tell him?" She recognized Derek's voice immediately, but she didn't recognize the quality of it. The confidence was gone. What was underneath it sounded less like anger and more like fear, wearing anger as a costume. Derek Kane pulled out of Ravenport. "You told him something." "What did you tell him?" "How are you, Derek?" "Don't do that." His voice sharpened. "Don't talk to me like I'm one of your projects." "What did you tell him?" "I think you should have this conversation with your attorney," Claire said. "Claire," something shifted in his voice then. The sharpness cracked slightly at the edge. "Listen to me. Whatever you think you found, whatever you think you're doing, you need to stop. There are things here you don't understand. Arrangements that Derek He stopped. "I understand everything," she said. "I understood it before I left Charlotte." Silence. "You need to speak with your attorney," she said again. And this time her voice was not cold, it was simply final. "Goodbye," she ended the call. She set her phone down. She sat for a moment in the quiet of her office, looking at the city through the glass wall. Then she picked up her work file and continued reading. 3 days later, Rachel Monroe called with news. Derek had filed an emergency civil claim. The complaint alleged that Claire had stolen confidential corporate information during their marriage and had used that information to benefit Kane Capital Partners, potentially exposing both herself and the firm to significant legal liability. He was seeking millions in damages, and he was requesting an injunction. If granted, the injunction would prevent Claire from participating in any transactions involving Whitmore Development, its competitors, or any project in which Whitmore Development held an interest. Rachel read the filing to her over the phone, and when she finished, the line was quiet for several seconds. "Claire," Rachel said, "this is serious. If the injunction is granted, I know what it would mean. It would effectively end your position at Kane Capital. You'd be legally prohibited from doing your job, I know, and the hearing is Monday morning." Claire looked at her calendar. She already knew what was on Sunday evening. Alexander had spent months negotiating the acquisition of Pacific Meridian Energy, a renewable infrastructure company based in San Francisco. The final negotiation session was scheduled for Sunday night. Claire was the lead analyst. She had built the valuation model. She had identified the counter leverage. She knew the deal architecture better than anyone else in the room. Without her, Kane Capital went into that negotiation without its most important piece. And without the Monday hearing, she potentially lost everything she had rebuilt. She looked at both dates on her calendar for a long time. Then she heard Alexander's voice in the doorway. "I assume Rachel already called you." She looked up. He was standing with a coffee in one hand and the Kane Capital legal team's preliminary analysis of the injunction claim in the other. "Yes," she said. He walked in. He sat across from her. He set the document on her desk. "Read it." She read it. The legal team's assessment was cautious but not hopeless. The injunction claim had significant weaknesses, but primarily that the evidence Claire had gathered and provided to counsel had been derived entirely from public records and legally obtained forensic work. She hadn't taken anything from Whitmore Development. She had simply been good at reading what was already visible. But these things were never certain. Judges had discretion. And Derek's attorneys were going to frame the narrative in the most damaging terms possible. "The hearing is Monday at 10, she said, "and the meeting ends Sunday night," Alexander said. He looked at her steadily. "Finish the deal, Claire. I won't make it back in time." Not commercially. Alexander looked at her for one long moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "I didn't say commercially," he said. And that was the moment Claire realized he was not talking about airlines. The morning after Claire signed the divorce papers, Derek Whitmore woke up in a 12,000-square-foot mansion and felt, for the first time in years, completely at ease. Vanessa was already awake beside him. She was scrolling through something on her phone, and when she noticed him watching her, she smiled, the particular smile she reserved for moments like this, the smile that said everything had worked out exactly the way they had planned. "She really took nothing," Vanessa said, not as a question. More like a confirmation she needed to say aloud to fully believe. "Nothing," Derek said. Vanessa set her phone down. "I almost feel bad for her." Derek laughed. It was a short, flat sound. "Don't." He reached for his coffee. "Claire made her choice," he said. "She always made her own choices. I just finally stopped pretending they were good ones." He said it so easily, so completely without guilt, as if 11 years had simply been a business arrangement that had run past its useful life, and he had done the reasonable thing by ending it cleanly. What he didn't say, what he would never say out loud, because saying it would require acknowledging something he preferred not to examine, was that the speed of her signature had unnerved him. Not obviously. Not enough to interrupt the satisfaction of the morning. But somewhere underneath that ease, something small and cold had lodged itself and was refusing to move. She hadn't fought. Claire Whitmore, who had fought for every one of his supplier contracts, every lender relationship, every percentage point of his company's survival, had sat across that conference table and simply not fought. Derek finished his coffee. He told himself it didn't matter. He was wrong. Because 400 miles away, in an extended-stay apartment with industrial carpet and bolted-down furniture, Claire Whitmore had been awake since 4 a.m, not crying, not grieving, not staring at the ceiling in the particular paralysis of a woman who had lost everything. She was working, legal pad covered in notes, old laptop open. 3 browsers running simultaneously, each pulling public financial data from different sources. And in the center of the legal pad, circled twice in red ink, 2 words she had written the night before: Blue Cedar. She had found the name 2 months before the divorce was finalized. She had found it buried inside a budget summary. She still had legitimate access to a document. She hadn't been looking for anything in. Just reading out of the restless, analytical habit that had defined her entire adult life. A company called Blue Cedar Consulting LLC had been paid $700,000 in a single billing quarter for project advisory services on a development in Mooresville. $700,000 for advisory services on a mid-size commercial project. Claire had read that number and felt the particular shift in her thinking that happened when something didn't fit, not an alarm. Exactly, more like a gear catching. She had searched for Blue Cedar. She had found essentially nothing, and she had made a decision in that moment that she had not fully articulated even to herself. She had signed the divorce papers without a fight. Not because she was defeated, because she needed Derek to believe she was. Now, in the apartment that smelled like industrial cleaner and other people's temporary lives, Claire pulled up every public filing she could access from her old laptop and began building the picture she had only glimpsed before. She wasn't ready to take it to anyone yet. She wasn't even sure what she was looking at. But she was going to know before she stopped. Her phone rang at 7:15. "Rachel Monroe, I need to ask you something," Rachel said, skipping her usual opener. "Ask yesterday in that conference room." A pause. "You knew something, didn't you?" It wasn't really a question. Claire looked at the legal pad, at the 2 circled words. "I'm working on it," she said. Rachel was quiet for a moment. "Claire, if there's something there, if Derek hid assets during the marriage, if there's financial misconduct involved in any of this, you need to be careful. The moment you start moving on it without the right structure around you, he will come at you legally and he will not be gentle about it." "I know. Do you have somewhere safe to work from? Someone you trust?" Claire thought about the name Malcolm Reeves had given her. "I'm working on that too," she said. She landed in Atlanta the following afternoon. And everything that came after the 30 seconds with her resume, the portfolio file, the 87 pages of analysis, the chair Alexander moved to the conference table. All of that had happened in the 10 days before Claire Whitmore walked into Kane Capital Partners with her name on a contract and a job that was entirely, irrevocably, undeniably her own. That was 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks that had done something to her she hadn't anticipated. Not healed her. Healing was a slower and less linear process than 6 weeks allowed for, but recalibrated her, reminded her of the precise, specific shape of her own mind when it was operating without interference. She had forgotten what that felt like. She remembered now. David Cho knocked on her office door on a Tuesday morning in late January, and Claire looked up from the analysis she was running on a mixed-use acquisition in Nashville to find him standing in the doorway, holding a manila folder, and wearing the expression of a man who was about to ask for something he wasn't entirely sure he deserved. David was 31, exceptionally sharp, with a master's from Wharton and the particular brand of professional confidence that came from being right often enough to trust his instincts, but not so often that he'd stopped questioning them. He was also the analyst who had originally recommended selling the portfolio Claire had saved with her zoning discovery, and he had been thoughtful enough about that to say so directly. "You have a minute?" he asked. "Close the door." He came in. He set the folder on the edge of her desk. "I'm looking at a retail strip acquisition in Greenville," he said. "The numbers work on their face. But there's a tenant concentration issue I can't figure out how to wait. 2 anchors are regional grocery chains. One of them is on a lease that expires in 18 months, and I can't get a clear read on whether they're likely to renew." "Who's the grocery chain?" he told her. "They've been consolidating their smaller format stores for the past 2 years," Claire said without hesitating. "They announced a revised real estate strategy in their last annual filing. They're prioritizing locations above a certain traffic threshold." She paused. "What's the daily count for that location?" David blinked. Then he opened the folder and found the number. He read it out. Claire shook her head. "That's below their revised threshold." David stared at the number for a moment. Then he looked up. "So the anchor renewal is a significant risk." "Yes," he sat back. "That changes the whole model. It changes the downside scenario substantially," Claire said. "It doesn't necessarily kill the deal, but you need to price the vacancy risk correctly." She slid her notepad across the "Run it with an 18-month anchor loss and see where you land on returns. If they still work at that occupancy level, you have a deal. If they don't, you have a different conversation with Alexander." David looked at the notepad, then at her. "How did you know about the grocery chain's real estate strategy?" I read their filing when, 3 weeks ago, he took the notepad. He paused at the door. I'm going to start running my preliminary reads past you before I take them upstairs, he said. Not asking, informing, like it was already a settled decision. That's fine, Claire said. He left. She went back to Nashville. 40 minutes later, Linda Park appeared in the doorway with a different file and a similar expression, the expression of someone who had discovered that asking Claire a question was simply a more efficient use of time than not asking. Claire answered the question. She went back to Nashville again. This was what her days had become, real work. Specific problems with specific answers that either held up under scrutiny or didn't. No politics, no managing Derek's ego, no preparing analysis she would never be credited for. Just the work itself, moving at the speed she was capable of moving at. She had not fully understood, until she was without it, how much weight she had been carrying that had nothing to do with her actual job. Alexander called her into his office on the first Thursday of February and told her Kane Capital had been invited to participate in the Southeastern Investment Forum in Charleston. It's a networking event, he said in the tone of a man describing something faintly tedious that was nonetheless professionally necessary. I know the forum, Claire said. I've attended before. With Whitmore? Yes, then you know the room. He looked at her. Kane Capital is positioning for a significant infrastructure push over the next 18 months. I need to be in front of the right people. I need someone with me who can read a room and tell me which conversations are worth having and which ones are social performance. He paused. That's you all right. The other thing, he set a folder on his desk. There's a reasonable probability Derek Whitmore will be in attendance. Claire looked at the folder. I know, she said. Is that a problem? She met his eyes directly. No, Alexander studied her for a moment, then he nodded once and picked up his phone, which meant the conversation was over. She left his office and stood in the hallway for a moment, alone, and breathed Charleston, the Southeastern Investment Forum. A ballroom full of the people who had spent 11 years watching her stand behind Derek Whitmore at exactly these events, handing him talking points on index cards before he walked into conversations she had spent hours preparing him for. The same people, a different version of her. She went back to her office. She kept working. The forum was held in a grand old hotel 2 blocks from the waterfront, the kind of place that had hosted this particular event for 15 consecutive years and had therefore developed a very specific rhythm of cocktails at 6:30, dinner at 8, structured conversations in between that were pretending not to be business meetings, but absolutely were. Claire wore midnight blue, simple cut, good fabric, nothing that announced itself. She walked into the ballroom beside Alexander at 6:47, and the first thing she noticed was that she felt none of the anxiety she had anticipated feeling. She had expected some version of the old feeling, the watchful, secondary alertness of a woman who was present in a room primarily to support someone else's performance in it. Instead, she felt calibrated, present like herself. The second thing she noticed was that people were approaching her, not approaching Alexander and then acknowledging her. Approaching her, Martin Fellows from Piedmont Capital, whom she had known peripherally for years, came directly to her with his hand extended and said he'd heard she had joined Kane Capital and that he'd been hoping to run into her because he had a question about distressed retail that he genuinely wanted her opinion on. She gave him her opinion. He listened the way people listen when they're actually receiving information, not just waiting to respond. She moved through the room with Alexander, and she noticed something happening that she had never experienced at these events before. She was a person in the room, not a presence attached to another person. People were stopping her. Executives were asking her about Kane Capital's infrastructure thesis. A pension fund representative she'd never met somehow already knew her name. She had been in Charlotte at these events for years. She had simply been invisible. She saw Derek at 8:12. He was standing near the bar on the east side of the room, and Vanessa was beside him in a gold dress that was doing precisely what it was designed to do. Derek was talking to 2 men Claire recognized as regional bank executives, and he was wearing the particular expression he wore when he was performing confidence for an audience, chin slightly elevated, laugh a fraction too large, the expression of a man reminding himself, through his own behavior, that he was significant. For a moment he didn't see her. She watched him without heat, without the tightening in the chest she had expected, without the complicated rush of emotion she had braced for on the plane down. She watched him the way she now watched financial statements, looking for the data underneath the presentation. What she saw was a man working harder than he should have to at looking comfortable. Then he turned, his eyes found her, and she watched something interesting move across his face. It took him 3 full seconds to process what he was seeing. She could see it happen, the recognition, then the recalibration, then the visible effort to reconstruct his expression into something that wasn't surprise. She was standing beside Alexander Kane. She was talking to people Derek had spent years trying to impress. She was not standing behind anyone. Derek crossed the room. She saw him coming. She finished her sentence to Martin Fellows, shook his hand, and turned to face her ex-husband with an expression that was perfectly pleasant and entirely unrevealing. Claire Derek's voice carried its full professional register, warm, controlled, the voice he used when he wanted to seem like the reasonable one in a situation. "I didn't know you'd be here, Derek." She matched his register exactly. "How are you?" He looked at Alexander Kane. He extended his hand. "Derek Whitmore, Whitmore Development. We've crossed paths at a few of these." Alexander shook his hand, said nothing. Derek smiled, and the smile had a specific quality. Claire recognized the quality of a man deciding to say something he had already decided he was going to say before he crossed the room. "I have to..." Derek, addressing Alexander while nodding toward Claire. "How you two connected?" "I'm guessing Malcolm Reeves." He always had a soft spot for Claire. "Miss Whitmore came in for a conversation," Alexander said. "She was right about something my entire senior team had missed. I hired her." "Right about what?" The question was light, curious, the performance of a man who was simply making conversation. "A $70 million mistake," Alexander said. "That we didn't make." The lightness left Derek's face. He recovered quickly. He was practiced at recovering quickly, and he turned back to Claire with an expression that was now doing more work than it looked like. "That's impressive," he said, to her directly, with the specific tone of a man who was trying to sound generous while communicating something else entirely. "I always said you had good instincts. I just thought you preferred to use them at home." The people nearby had gone quiet in the way people go quiet when they sense that a conversation has crossed from social into something else. Claire looked at Derek for a moment. "You thought a lot of things," she said. "Most of them were about you." She turned back to Alexander. "I think Jared Whitfield just came in. He's the infrastructure committee chair we wanted to reach." Alexander looked across the room. "I see him." They moved on. Derek stood where he was. She was at the dinner table between Alexander and Martin Fellows when she overheard Derek, 3 seats down and across, mention Ravenport Commons to the bank executive beside him. She didn't turn her head. She kept her face toward Martin, who was talking about pension fund allocation strategies, and she listened to Derek with the other part of her attention, the part that had spent 11 years operating simultaneously on 2 levels, the social surface and the analytical depth running underneath it. Derek was describing Ravenport as a landmark project, a commercial development that would anchor an entire corridor. He was describing the construction timeline, the projected returns, the financing structure. He spoke with the fluency of a man who had rehearsed this particular pitch until it was second nature. And something in the numbers he was using didn't add up. Claire had heard the Ravenport name before. She had heard it 2 years ago, when she and Derek had stood on that gravel access road in the gray afternoon, and she had told him what the land was worth and what it could become. She remembered what she had said the development budget should look like. She had been precise. She had a very specific figure in her memory. The number Derek was casually citing to the banker beside him was 40% higher. She kept her expression perfectly neutral. She picked up her fork. She finished dinner. She told Martin Fellows it had been a genuine pleasure. And the following morning, back in Atlanta, she opened a new investigation. The first thing she found was Blue Cedar. Not for the first time she had found it before, in the extended stay apartment, circled twice in red ink on a legal pad. But she had only seen it in one context then. Now, running proper research with Kane Capital's database access and the forensic tools available to her in her director position, she has started finding it everywhere. Blue Cedar Consulting LLC had received payments from Whitmore Development across at least 4 separate projects. Not just Mooresville, not just Ravenport, 4 projects over 3 years, with payment totals she was still adding up but that were already pushing past $20 million. $20 million to a company with no employees, no operating history, no website, and a registered address that was a mailbox in a Wilmington office services center. She followed the corporate structure the way she followed financial models, methodically, without skipping steps, never assuming she knew where she was going until she had actually arrived. Blue Cedar connected to a holding company called TerraPath Ventures LLC. TerraPath connected through a second registered agent to a trust instrument filed in Delaware. The trust's listed trustee was a man named Warren Aldous, who appeared to be a professional trustee, the kind of attorney who signed his name to trust instruments on behalf of other people's assets for a fee. Warren Aldous was the trustee, but the trust had a second-named party. A party described in the instrument as the investment director, the person with actual authority over the trust's assets. Calvin Mercer, Derek's CFO. Claire sat back from her desk. Her office was quiet. Everyone else on the floor had gone to lunch. She looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Calvin Mercer had been with Whitmore Development for 9 years. He was 54, steady, professionally invisible in the way that powerful financial officers often were, the person who made everything run, who knew where every number came from, who had the kind of institutional knowledge that made him effectively indispensable. He was also, apparently, the person who had been moving $31 million through a structure of Shell Companies and Family Trust Us, while Claire had been building financial models at the kitchen table and attending charity dinners and stepping further into the background. She pulled up Calvin Mercer's professional history. She found something else. In a bankruptcy filing from 2 years ago, a subcontractor that had worked on one of Whitmore Development's earlier projects, there was a creditor list. Most of the creditors were standard material suppliers, equipment lessors, subcontractors owed for completed work. But one creditor was listed as TerraPath Ventures, with a claim amount that had been partially satisfied before the bankruptcy was resolved. TerraPath, the same entity that sat between Blue Cedar and Calvin Mercer's trust, the same entity that had no visible business purpose except to receive money from one place and send it to another. The subcontractor had been paid by Whitmore Development. TerraPath had been a creditor of the subcontractor. The subcontractor had gone bankrupt. TerraPath had filed a claim, which meant the money trail was not just running from Whitmore Development through Blue Cedar and into the trust. It was running through the subcontractors themselves, real companies with real employees who had done real work, whose relationship with TerraPath gave Calvin Mercer a legal mechanism to extract money at multiple points in the chain. It was sophisticated, it was designed to be invisible. And it had been invisible for 3 years to everyone who had been in a position to see it. Everyone except a woman who had been trained to find what wasn't supposed to be found, who had spent 11 years reading financial documents that weren't hers and seeing patterns that weren't meant to be visible. Claire closed all her browser windows. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk. Then she stood up, walked 3 floors down, and knocked on Alexander Kane's office door. "Come in." He was on the phone when she entered. He looked at her face and said into the receiver, "I'll call you back," and set the phone down. "Talk to me," he said. She put the summary on his desk. Not everything. A clean, structured overview, the Blue Cedar payments across 4 projects, the corporate chain to Calvin Mercer's trust, the subcontractor bankruptcy connection, and her preliminary estimate of the total diverted funds. Alexander read it without speaking. He read it twice. Then he set it down and looked at her. "How long have you been building this?" "Since I left Charlotte." "You knew when you signed the papers." "I suspected," she said. "I needed distance from the situation before I could see it clearly. And I needed resources I didn't have in Charlotte." He looked at her steadily. "Does Derek know you've been looking?" "He will," she said. "When Kane Capital withdraws from Ravenport," Alexander absorbed that. "You're telling me this gets worse before it gets better?" "Yes, for Derek. Yes, and potentially for us, if he decides to make it a legal problem. He'll try." Alexander sat back. He put his hands together on the desk. He looked at the summary one more time and then back at Claire, and what moved across his face then was not alarm. It was something much quieter and more serious than alarm. "Don't chase revenge," he said. "Chase proof. I know the difference, do you?" He wasn't challenging her. He was asking. She thought about Derek's hand on her wrist in the conference room. She thought about the sound of his laughter when she walked away. "It stopped being personal," she said, "when I found Calvin Mercer's name." Alexander considered her for a long moment. Then he leaned forward and picked up his phone. "I'm calling our forensic accounting team," he said. "Whatever we do from this point, it gets done correctly. Public records only, independent verification only. Everything through counsel." He looked at her. "You work alongside them, not in front of them." "Understood." And Claire, she stopped at the door. "Well done," he said, not warmly, not with the particular softness of someone offering comfort. Simply directly, the way he said everything, as a statement of fact that he had evaluated and found accurate. She nodded once. She went back to work. The forensic team spent 3 weeks on it. Claire spent those 3 weeks alongside them, providing context, identifying where to look, reading the documents they produced, and telling them what the numbers meant in plain language. She slept 4 to 6 hours a night. She ate at her desks. She called Rachel Monroe at 10 o'clock one Wednesday evening and talked through the legal exposure for an hour, Not because she needed reassurance, but because she needed Rachel to understand the full shape of what was coming. "How bad is it?" Rachel asked. 31 million. "Minimum, possibly 37 when we finish the Ravenport analysis." Silence on the line. "Claire," Rachel said carefully, "that's not inflated billing. That's a sustained, structured fraud scheme. We're talking about criminal exposure here. Not just for Calvin Mercer, potentially for Derek, depending on what the evidence shows about what he knew and when he knew it." "I know. And the lender issue. I know that too. If the loans were secured using financial statements, this represents the true cost structure." Rachel. "Right. You know, a breath. What do you want to do with it?" Claire thought about that for a moment. "We make it available to the appropriate people through appropriate channels," she said. "We don't use it as leverage. We don't go to Derek with it. We don't negotiate. We put it where it belongs and we let the process work." "That's the right answer legally," Rachel said. "It's also the harder answer personally." "I know which one I'm choosing," Claire said. She hung up. She turned back to the documents. This was the forensic team's lead accountant, a precise and economical woman named Sandra Voss, who found the email. It was not in any public filing. It was in the records produced by the subcontractor bankruptcy records that were part of the public court file because the bankruptcy trustee had included them as exhibits in a dispute over the Terapath creditor claim. The email was from Derek's personal account. It was addressed to Calvin Mercer. It was dated 3 days after Kane Capital had withdrawn from the Ravenport financing. The body of the email was 6 words. 6 words that Sandra read aloud to Claire in a conference room on a Thursday afternoon in a voice that was professionally neutral and completely without drama. "Claire knows. Clean it up now." The conference room was silent. Claire looked at those 6 words on the printed page. She read them 3 times, then she said very quietly, "He knew. He knew what he was doing, and he knew that I knew, and his first instinct was to hide it faster." Sandra said nothing. Claire sat with the email for a long moment. Then she said, "This goes to counsel today." Sandra nodded. "Already scheduled. The evidence was assembled. The appropriate regulatory and investigative authorities were notified through legal channels. Alexander's attorneys filed the required disclosures. Kane Capital's withdrawal from Ravenport became official. And 3 days later, Derek Whitmore called Claire's cell phone at 6:40 in the morning. She looked at the number for 2 rings, she answered. "You need to stop." His voice was not angry. It was something rawer than anger, something that lived underneath the performance. He usually maintained the voice of a man who had stopped performing because the audience had already seen the thing he was performing around. "Derek, I mean it, Claire. Whatever you think you've done, wherever you've sent this, I can make this disappear. I have relationships with the people you've gone to. I have history with them. If you think a woman signed us away everything in a divorce settlement is going to walk in with some financial analysis she's assembled out of bitterness and Derek." He stopped. "I'm going to say this once," Claire said. "What I found is real. What I sent is documented. What happens next is not mine to control. And your characterization of why I looked for it doesn't change what I found." A sound on the line. "Not quite words. Talk to your attorney," Claire said. "I'm going to go to work." She ended the call. She set her phone down on her kitchen counter. She poured a second cup of coffee, and her hand was completely steady. The filing came 4 days later. Rachel called at 7:15 in the morning and read the complaint to Claire over the phone in the careful, slightly too controlled voice that attorneys used when they were delivering bad news they had already processed emotionally, so the client didn't have to process it while also watching them process it. Derek had filed an emergency civil claim. He was alleging that Claire had accessed and misappropriated confidential corporate information during their marriage and had used that information to benefit Kane Capital Partners and to orchestrate damage to Whitmore Development's business relationships. He was seeking damages and he was requesting an emergency injunction. If the injunction was granted, Claire would be legally prohibited from participating in any transactions or analysis involving Whitmore Development, its competitors, or any overlapping market. The injunction, if granted, would make her current position at Kane Capital legally untenable. Rachel finished reading. The line was quiet. "The hearing is Monday morning at 10, Rachel said. Claire looked at her calendar. Sunday evening was the Pacific Meridian negotiation in San Francisco. She had been the lead analyst on Pacific Meridian for 3 months. She had built the valuation model. She had found the leverage point that nobody else had seen. She had structured the counter-proposal that Alexander had told her, without ornament, was the most strategically sound negotiation document he had reviewed in 7 years. Sunday night in San Francisco, Monday morning in Charlotte. She looked at those 2 obligations sitting side by side in her calendar. Rachel's voice. "I heard you," Claire said. She picked up her coffee. "Get me everything on the injunction claim," she said. "I'll have read it by tonight. And Sunday?" Claire looked at the calendar one more time. "I'll handle Sunday," she said. She hung up. She stood in her kitchen for a moment in the quiet of the early morning. Then she picked up her work phone and texted Alexander. 3 words: "We need to talk." His response came in 40 seconds. "My office, 20 minutes." She walked out her front door. He was already at his desk when she arrived. He had the legal team's preliminary response to the injunction filing in front of him, which meant he had already been briefed, which meant he had received the filing before she had called Rachel, which meant he had spent the first part of his morning reading a document that claimed his director of special situations had corrupted his firm's investment process. He looked up when she walked in. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He pushed the legal team's analysis across the desk. She read it. The assessment was cautious. The injunction had weaknesses, real ones, primarily around the sourcing of the evidence and the absence of any confidential Whitmore material in Kane Capital's files. But it was not dismissible. A judge had discretion. Derek's attorneys were going to tell a very specific story, and stories had a way of being persuasive regardless of the underlying facts. She set the document down. "I know what Sunday means," she said before he could speak. "Do you? Pacific Meridian is a $1 billion deal. I'm the lead analyst. Without me in San Francisco, you go in missing the most important piece." She paused. "And if I don't make it back for Monday's hearing, Derek gets a default ruling and the injunction likely stands." Alexander looked at her. "He chose Monday deliberately," she said. "He knows about Pacific Meridian. He knows the timeline. He's trying to make me choose." "And what are you choosing?" She met his eyes. "San Francisco," she said. "I finished the deal, and Monday," she held his gaze. "I'll be there commercially. You cannot make that flight." The word hung in the air between them. Commercially. Claire looked at him, and Alexander Kane, who had not smiled at her in the entire time she had worked for him, not actually smiled. Not the real version, looked back at her with something in his expression that was adjacent to it. "The Gulfstream leaves Sunday night," he said. "The moment the contract is signed." She looked at him for a moment. "Alexander, don't thank me," he said. "Finish the deal first. Then we'll see if there's anything to thank me for." She stood. She walked to the door. "Claire." She turned. Alexander was looking at her with the particular directness he used when he was saying something he meant completely. "6 months ago," he said, "you walked into this office thinking you needed someone to give you a second chance." She waited. "You were wrong," he said. "You needed someone to stop standing in your way." He picked up his phone. The conversation was over. Claire walked out into the hallway. She stood there for a moment alone. And then she went to prepare for the most important negotiation of her career, knowing that on the other side of it, in a Charlotte courtroom on a Monday morning, the man who had spent 11 years underestimating her was about to find out exactly what that had cost him. The flight to San Francisco was 3 hours and 40 minutes. Claire spent all of it working, not reviewing, not rereading documents she had already memorized. Actually working, building contingency positions for scenarios she hadn't fully modeled yet, running sensitivity analyses on Pacific Meridian's debt covenant structure, preparing 3 separate counter-proposals for 3 separate versions of how Sunday night's negotiation could break. She had learned something about herself over the past 6 months that she hadn't fully known before. She worked best under pressure that had a specific shape. Not the diffuse, ambient pressure of a marriage that had slowly convinced her she wasn't enough. The specific bounded pressure of a problem with edges, a problem she could locate, measure and solve. Sunday night had edges, Monday morning had edges. She intended to solve both. The Kane Capital team landed at SFO at 4:15 Pacific time. Alexander had said almost nothing on the flight. He was a man who did not narrate his thinking in advance of needing to deploy it, and Claire had come to understand that his silences were not absence, they were preparation. He sat across the aisle from her with a single folder open on his tray table and read the same 3 pages 4 times, which meant he was not reading them. He was thinking through something. She didn't ask what. She went back to her contingency models. The car from the airport moved through early evening traffic, and Rachel Monroe called at 5:47. Derek's attorneys filed a supplemental brief this afternoon, Rachel said without preamble. "What's in it?" "They've added an allegation that you accessed Whitmore Development's internal financial system remotely after the divorce filing was initiated. They're claiming you used credentials that should have been deactivated." Claire felt something cold move through her chest. "That's not true," she said. "I know it's not true. But they've submitted a declaration from Whitmore Development's IT director stating that your credentials were active in their system for 11 days after the filing date." Because Derek asked IT to keep my access open. He told me to keep working on the Q3 supplier review through the end of October. I have the text messages. A pause. You have the texts. I have every one of them. She heard Rachel exhale the particular exhale of an attorney who has just seen a problem transform from serious into manageable. Send them to me tonight, Rachel said. I'll send them in an hour. She hung up. Alexander glanced across the aisle. Problem? He asked. Managed, she said. He looked at her for a half-second longer than necessary, which from Alexander Kane was the equivalent of a lengthy, reassuring speech. Then he looked back at his folder. Pacific Meridian Energy's offices occupied the top 2 floors of a building in the financial district, and Richard Langford, its founder, its largest shareholder, and the man who had been negotiating with Alexander Kane for 4 months without reaching an agreement met them in the elevator lobby, with the particular energy of a man who was performing relaxation. Richard was 58, silver-haired, with the physical confidence of someone who had spent decades being the most important person in most rooms. He had built Pacific Meridian from a single wind project in the Mojave into a regional renewable infrastructure company with a portfolio worth, depending on how you valued certain development stage assets, somewhere between $800 million and $1.2 billion. The gap between those two numbers was precisely where 4 months of negotiations had failed to find common ground. Richard extended his hand to Alexander. Good to see you in person, he said warmly. Then he turned to Claire. Miss Whitmore, I've heard a great deal about you. All of it accurate, I hope, Claire said pleasantly. Richard smiled. We'll find out tonight. Won't we? They went inside. The negotiating had 8 people on Pacific Meridian's side. Richard, 2 board members, their lead M&A attorney, a financial advisor from a San Francisco investment bank, and 3 people whose roles Claire had not yet identified, but whose positioning at the table told her they were there to observe. Not to speak, on the Kane Capital side, Alexander, Claire, their outside counsel Marcus Webb, and 1 junior analyst named Peter Shue, who was there to run numbers on demand. Richard's opening position was the same position he had held for 4 months, a valuation of $1.1 billion, with Cade Capital acquiring a 60% controlling stake and Richard retaining operational authority for a mandatory 5-year period. Alexander's counter was the same counter he had held for 4 months, $850 million controlling stake, with a transition to professional management within 18 months. They were $250 million and 3.5 years apart. The first hour was performance. Claire had expected that. High-stakes negotiations always began with performance, both sides restating positions they already knew, establishing the emotional temperature of the room, watching each other's faces for information that would only become useful later. She sat to Alexander's left and said almost nothing, which was precisely what she intended to do for the first hour. She watched Richard, and Richard Langford, she noticed, kept glancing at his watch. Not obviously, not in a way that announced itself. The kind of glance that a person does when they are trying not to do it, and therefore doing it slightly more than they would if they simply let to themselves. She had seen that behavior before. She pulled up Pacific Meridian's financing documents on the tablet in front of her and started looking for a covenant she had noticed 3 weeks ago, but had not fully traced. She found it at 11:47 Pacific time. She wrote 4 words on the notepad in front of her and slid it 6 inches toward Alexander without looking at him. He glanced down. He read the 4 words. He did not change his expression. At midnight, Richard declared a 15-minute break. The Pacific Meridian team moved to the far end of the room. Alexander leaned toward Claire. Are you certain? He said. Very quiet. Debt covenant, she said, equally quiet. Private placement note from 3 years ago. If Pacific Meridian's liquidity ratio drops below a specified threshold before end of calendar year, the note holders have the right to demand accelerated repayment. The current ratio is within 5% of that threshold. Their fiscal year ends December 31st. She looked at him. That's 11 days. Alexander was still for a moment. If they don't close a deal, any significant deal before end of year, they trigger the covenant. Yes, what's the accelerated repayment figure? Approximately $240 million. The silence between them lasted about 4 seconds. They need this deal more than they've been showing, Alexander said. They need any deal, Claire said, but they need this one most. Because it's the only one that closes fast enough and at a size that resolves the liquidity issue cleanly. Alexander straightened in his chair. All right, he said. I want to lead the next session, Claire said. He looked at her. It has to be me, she said. If you adjust the position, it reads as the principal blinking. If I adjust it, it reads as the analyst presenting a revised analysis. It gives Richard a way to respond without losing face. Alexander studied her for a moment. "Don't give him too much room," he said. "I won't give him any room he doesn't need," she said. Richard came back to the table. Claire opened the revised analysis document she had spent 40 minutes building on the flight and had been updating for the last hour on her tablet. She set it in front of her and looked at Richard Langford directly. "Mr. Langford," she said, "I'd like to try something different." Richard looked mildly surprised, not at her speaking, but at the specific quality of her attention, the directness of it. "By all means, Ms. Whitmore, the gap in this negotiation isn't actually about valuation," she said. "It's about risk. Your board believes that Kane Capital's management transition timeline undervalues the operational risk of moving Pacific Meridian to new leadership before the pipeline projects are fully established. Is that a fair characterization?" Richard glanced at his board members. "That's a fair characterization." "Then let me address the risk directly rather than adjusting the number." She turned the document toward him. "We're proposing a revised structure, a tiered valuation tied to milestone performance-based acquisition at $925 million, with conditional earnout provisions that can take the total consideration up to $1.08 billion, depending on project completion benchmarks over 36 months. Management transition at 24 months instead of 18, with a co-management structure during the transition period that keeps your operational team engaged." Richard looked at the document. His financial advisor leaned in. His board members looked at each other. And Richard Langford, for the first time in 4 months of negotiations, picked up a pen. He didn't sign anything. What he did was start asking questions, specific, structural financial questions that you only asked when you were no longer arguing about whether to make a deal, and had started arguing about how. His attorney started making margin notes. His financial advisor pulled up a calculator. Claire answered every question. Some of them she answered immediately, because she had anticipated them and built the answers into the document. Some of them she turned to Peter Shue for, and Peter ran the numbers and slid the results back to her within 4 minutes each time. One of them a question about tax treatment of the earnout provisions under a specific scenario. She answered correctly from memory, and she saw Richard's financial advisor look up from his calculator with an expression that meant he had just verified she was right. It was 11 minutes past 1 in the morning when Richard leaned back and said, "I need 15 minutes with my board, of course," Claire said. The Pacific Meridian team withdrew. Marcus Webb leaned across the table toward Alexander. "That structure is aggressive on our side. The earnout ceiling is within acceptable parameters," Alexander said. Claire ran the downside scenarios. Marcus looked at her. "All of them? 3 separate sensitivity models," she said. "The maximum earnout is achievable but requires Pacific Meridian to hit benchmarks they have historically underperformed. The expected payout based on their actual completion rate is significantly below the ceiling." Marcus absorbed that. "So we've presented a number that looks generous and is actually conservative. We've presented a structure that's fair to both sides based on actual performance," Claire said. "If they hit the benchmarks, they earn the higher number. If they perform the way they've historically performed, we pay something close to our original position." Marcus looked at Alexander. Alexander was watching the door through which Richard's team had disappeared. "She's right," Alexander said. Simply that. Marcus sat back. Richard came back at 1:29. He sat down across from Claire. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who had been in enough negotiations to recognize when he was on the wrong side of one, and who was deciding how to respond to that recognition without appearing to respond to it. "The earnout structure," he said, "the 36-month window." "Yes, I want 48. Claire felt Alexander shift almost imperceptibly beside her. She kept her eyes on Richard. "The earnout window is tied to the financing structure," she said. "Extending to 48 months creates carrying costs on our side that affect the overall economics. Then adjust the base for the carrying cost. The base is already positioned to account for transition risk. Adjusting it further changes the risk profile of the entire acquisition." Richard looked at her steadily. "Ms. Whitmore, I've been doing this for 30 years. I know when someone's run the numbers, and I know when they're holding a position to hold it." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm not asking for 48 months because I want to fight you. I'm asking because my development team needs that runway to deliver what the earnout requires. If you hold me to 36 and my team misses a benchmark by 30 days because of a permitting delay, I've lost real money for a reason that has nothing to do with performance." Claire looked at him. He was telling the truth. She could hear it not in the words, but in the specific way he had stopped performing when he said it. For the first time in 4 hours, Richard Langford was not negotiating. He was explaining. She pulled the tablet toward her and ran a rapid calculation. 40 months, she said. Richard blinked. Not 48, she said. 40, with a force majeure carve-out for regulatory delays beyond 60 days. If a benchmark is missed due to a documented permitting delay exceeding 60 days, it rolls to the following quarter without penalty. Richard's financial advisor said something quietly into his ear. Richard listened. He looked at Claire. 40 months with the carve-out, he said. Yes, he was quiet for a moment. All right, he said. He looked at his attorney. His attorney picked up his pen. They were 20 minutes from a signed contract when Richard Langford's phone lit up on the table beside him. He glanced at it reflexively. Everyone at the tables saw him do it, and something moved across his face that had not been there before. He picked up the phone. He stood. He said, "Excuse me for a moment," in a voice that had changed quality entirely, and he walked quickly to the side door and through it. The room was quiet. Richard's board members looked at each other. Claire looked at Alexander. Alexander was looking at the door. 7 minutes passed. Richard came back. He sat down. He did not pick up his pen. "I need to revisit the base valuation," he said. The temperature of the room changed in a specific way, the way it changed when something that had been moving forward abruptly stopped, and everyone recalibrated simultaneously. Marcus Webb straightened in his chair. Claire kept her expression neutral. "We've been negotiating in good faith for 4 hours," she said carefully. "We've moved substantially from our opening position." "What's changed?" Richard looked at her, then at Alexander, then back at her. "I've received an approach," he said. "A competing offer, preliminary, but I'm obligated to consider it." Alexander spoke for the first time in nearly 2 hours. "Who?" Richard shook his head. "I'm not in a position to disclose." "Then I'm not in a position to revise what we've already agreed to," Alexander said. Richard looked at his board members again. Claire was watching Richard's face. Not his words, his face, and what she saw there was not the face of a man who had just received a better offer. It was the face of a man who had received a phone call that had frightened him and was now using the language of a competing offer because it was the only professional mechanism available to him to pause a process that had suddenly become more complicated than he knew how to handle. She leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Langford," she said quietly, "is there a problem with the transaction itself?" "Beyond valuation." Richard looked at her. Something in his face shifted. "There's a due diligence matter that's been raised," he said, after a pause that told her he hadn't planned to say that, regarding certain asset classifications in the development portfolio. "A third party has apparently raised questions." Claire looked at him steadily. "What kind of questions?" Rich picked up its text. "Set it down." "The nature of certain infrastructure licenses and whether they were properly disclosed in the offering." Since Claire had read every word of Pacific Meridian's offering documents 3 times, she had flagged 2 ambiguities in the infrastructure license section and had already obtained legal opinions from 2 independent sources confirming that the ambiguities were disclosure format issues, not substantive concerns. She had prepared for this. She hadn't expected it to arrive at 2 in the morning from a competitor, but she had prepared for it. She pulled a separate folder from her case and set it on the table. "We identified the license classification issue 6 weeks ago," she said. "We obtained 2 independent legal opinions. Both confirmed that the disclosure format, while non-standard, is consistent with SEC guidance for development stage infrastructure assets." She opened the folder. "The licenses themselves are valid. The underlying assets are what they are represented to be." Richard stared at the folder. His attorney reached for it. "Who raised this with you?" Claire asked. Tonight, in the last half hour, Richard was watching his attorney read the legal opinions. "I'm not going to disclose that," he said. "Was it someone who knew we were here tonight?" Richard looked at her then. And she knew. She didn't have a name, she didn't have proof. But the timing, a competing approach materializing at 2 in the morning on the specific night of Pacific Men's entries in final negotiation with Kane Capital, raising a concern that would only be concerning to someone who hadn't done thorough due diligence, told her something very specific about who had made that call. Someone who wanted this deal to fall apart. Someone who understood that if Claire closed this deal tonight, she would board a plane back to Charlotte with the professional ability to walk into Monday's hearing from a position of absolute strength. Someone who had decided apparently that disrupting the deal was his last available move. She looked at Alexander. He was looking at her. She gave the smallest possible shake of her head, "Not now," and turned back to Richard. "The legal opinions speak for themselves," she said. "I'd ask your attorney to read them in full before you make any decision based on an approach that arrived." without documentation at 2 in the morning. Richard's attorney looked up from the folder. He said something quietly to Richard in a voice too low for Claire to hear. Richard listened. His attorney said something else. Richard set his hands flat on the table and then he picked up his pen. The contract was signed at 2:47 in the morning. Richard Langford shook Alexander's hand. Then he turned to Claire and held out his hand and looked at her with the expression of a man who had spent 4 months underestimating what he was negotiating against. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "that was one of the more impressive nights I've had at this table. Thank you. Mr. Langford, whoever called you tonight, that was a dirty move." She held his gaze. "I'm aware." He nodded once, then he let go of her hand. The Kane Capital team gathered their materials. Marcus Webb was already on his phone, presumably notifying the legal team that the contract was signed. Peter Shue looked like a man who had just finished a marathon and wasn't sure if he was allowed to sit down yet. Alexander came to stand beside Claire while she closed her case. "The call he received," Alexander said quietly. "I don't have a name," she said. "You don't need one." She looked at him. "Only one person knew we were here tonight who would benefit from that deal falling apart," Alexander said. "And only one person would think that if we left San Francisco without a contract, you'd be too depleted to defend yourself on Monday morning." Claire closed the latches on her case. "He was wrong," she said. Alexander almost smiled. "He was wrong," he agreed. They walked to the elevator. In the lobby, Claire checked her phone for the first time since they'd entered the building. 4 messages from Derek. She didn't read them. One from Rachel. "Call me when you land. I need to tell you something about Monday." One from an unknown number sent at 2:18 in the morning, which was she checked approximately 30 minutes after Richard had received his mysterious call. The unknown number's message was 2 lines. "Running away again? You should have taken the deal when I offered it." Claire stared at that message for a moment. Then she put her phone in her bag. The car was waiting. The Gulfstream was at a private terminal 20 minutes downtown. Alexander had called ahead during the drive, and by the time they arrived the aircraft was ready fueled. Flight plan filed, crew briefed. Claire changed in the aircraft's small forward cabin, trading her negotiation clothes for the ivory suit she had hung carefully in the closet before the flight to San Francisco. She sat down with the evidence binder Rachel had prepared and opened her laptop for the encrypted call. Rachel's face appeared on screen at 3:52 in the morning Pacific time. "The supplemental brief," Rachel said immediately. "Derek's attorneys filed a second one this evening, 2 hours ago. What's in it?" Rachel looked at the document in front of her. "They've identified a witness, a former Kane Capital analyst who they're claiming will testify that you directed him to access Whitmore Bisfalthamelpentid facial projection using a data aggregation service that compiled information from non-public sources." Claire felt the specific cold clarity that came to her when something unexpected required immediate assessment. "Who is it?" "His name is Thomas Garrett. He left Kane Capital 8 months ago." "Do you know him?" She did. Thomas Garrett had left the firm, had been asked to leave the firm after a performance review that Claire had been involved in. He had been given a generous severance and a neutral reference on the explicit condition that he conduct himself professionally on his way out. He had apparently decided that condition no longer served him. "What Thomas Garrett will testify," Claire said carefully, "is that I asked him to pull a data aggregation report on commercial development projects in the Charlotte market. Which is true. What he will not be able to testify, because it is not true, is that the aggregation service used non-public sources. It was a commercially available research platform. We had a subscription. Every analyst at Kane Capital used it routinely." Rachel was writing. "Do you have the subscription records?" "Kane Capital's technology team will have them. Every query is logged. I'll subpoena them tonight." "There's something else," Claire said. Rachel looked up. "The call Richard Langford received tonight. Someone called him at 2 in the morning and tried to derail our negotiation by raising a due diligence concern that had already been resolved. The concern was specific enough that it required inside knowledge of our deal structure." She paused. "That call came from someone who knew we were in San Francisco and wanted this deal to fail." Rachel was quiet for a moment. "Can you prove it was Derek?" "Not yet. But the timing of his text messages to me tonight lines up with the timing of Richard's phone call." "That's circumstantial. For now," Claire said. "Document it anyway." "Already am," Rachel said. She paused. "Claire, I need to ask you something directly. Are you ready for tomorrow?" Claire looked out the aircraft window. The private terminal's lights were receding as the Gulfstream climbed. Below, the Bay Area's lights spread out in every direction, millions of people asleep, the city doing the quiet overnight work of just continuing to exist. "Yes," Claire said. "Derek's attorneys are going to be aggressive. They're going to frame this as a bitter ex-wife who couldn't accept a fair settlement and decided to use her new manufacturer legal problems for her former husband. They're going to use the Thomas Garrett Declaration to suggest impropriety in how you gathered information. They're going to paint Alexander Kane as someone who weaponized a vulnerable woman's access to Rachel. Rachel stopped. I know what they're going to say, Claire said quietly. I've known for 3 weeks what they were going to say. That's why I spent 3 weeks making sure every document was sourced correctly, every step was taken through proper channels, and every piece of evidence that matters came from public records or legally obtained forensic work. A pause. Tell me about the email, Claire said. Rachel's expression changed. Not dramatically, but perceptibly. Sandra Voss's team found it in the bankruptcy exhibits, Rachel said. It's in the filing, Derek to Calvin Mercer, 6 words. Sent 3 days after Kane Capital withdrew from Ravenport. She looked directly at the camera. This email does not just damage Derek's civil claim against you. It potentially implicates him in the underlying fraud, because the only reason to tell your CFO to clean it up after a financial firm pulls out of your project is if you know there's something to clean. Claire was quiet for a moment. Is it admissible tomorrow? It came from a public court record. Yes, then use it I will, Rachel said. She looked at the time on her screen. What time does your plane land? Claire looked at the navigation display on the bulkhead. The weather overlay showed a band of low pressure over the southeast. Their route had been adjusted to avoid the worst of it, which added time. She did the math. We land between 8:15 and 8:30, she said. The hearing was moved, Rachel said. Claire went still. Derek's attorneys filed an emergency motion to move the hearing start time. The judge granted it. Rachel's voice was steady and deliberate. It starts at 9. The aircraft cabin was quiet except for the sound of the engines. 8:15 to 8:30 landing, 9 o'clock hearing. Charlotte Douglas Airport was 22 minutes from the courthouse and no traffic. At 8:15 on a Monday morning, was not no traffic. She didn't say anything for a moment. Rachel let her not say anything. Then Claire said he moved the time, yes. He knew our landing window. He has people who track flight plans, Rachel said. Private aviation filings are public record. Claire felt something move through her that was not panic. Panic was diffuse and paralyzing, and this was neither. It was the sharp, focused sensation of a problem acquiring a new constraint, and the immediate instinct to solve for the new constraint rather than grieve the loss of the easier version. If we land at 8:15, we have 45 minutes, she said. In best-case traffic. What does Monday morning traffic look like on the airport corridor? Bad, Rachel said flatly. It's always bad. Claire looked at the navigation display again. The weather band, the adjusted route, 8:15 to 8:30. She looked at Alexander, who had been sitting across the aisle reading and had, at some point in the last 2 minutes, stopped reading and was watching her instead. The hearing was moved to 9, she said. He didn't react with alarm. He reacted the way he always reacted to new information, with a stillness that meant he was already calculating. Landing window, he said. 8:15 at best. He looked at the bulkhead, at the navigation display, at the weather overlay. Then he stood and walked forward to speak with the crew. He came back 30 seconds later. We're requesting a priority approach vector, he said. It shaves 8 minutes off the landing sequence. We'll be on the ground by 8:10 if the tower approves it. And if they don't, then we work with 8:20. 40 minutes, 22 minutes in best-case traffic. The remaining 18 minutes were not a comfortable margin. She looked back at Rachel on the screen. I'll be there, she said. Rachel looked at her for a moment. I know, she said. And then I'll stall if I need to. Opening statements. Procedural motions. I can buy you time if you're running close. Don't manufacture delays on my out, Claire said. Just be ready. She closed the laptop. She opened the evidence binder. She went back to work. Derek's messages continued arriving. She didn't read them while she was working. But during the 40 minutes, when she had reviewed everything she was going to review, and there was nothing left to prepare, she went back and read them in order. The first had come at 1:14 in the morning, which was while she was still at the negotiating table. I know where you are. I know what you're trying to do. It won't work. The second at 2:22, which was approximately when Richard Langford's phone had lit up. Running away again? You should have taken the deal when I offered it. The third at 3:45. The hearing is at 9 now. You won't make it. Smart attorneys cut their losses. And the fourth, which had come at 17 in the morning, which was, she noted, very early for a man who had once told her he considered 6:30 an unreasonably early start to any day was different from the others. I'm giving you one last chance. Call your attorney and tell her you're withdrawing the fraud evidence you submitted to the SEC. Tell her you got it wrong. Tell her you were acting out a personal bias and the investigation was based on mischaracterized data. Do that by 8 a.m. and I withdraw the civil claim and we both go home. Claire read that message twice, then she read it a third time. She thought about what it meant that Derek Whitmore, at 5:17 in the morning, was offering her a way out of his own lawsuit. A man who believed he had a winning case did not offer the other side a settlement at 5 in the morning. A man who believed he had a winning case did not move a court hearing time to 9 o'clock specifically to disrupt the travel plans of the person he was suing. A man who believed he had a winning case did not call the founder of a company at 2 in the morning to try to kill a deal that had nothing to do with him. What Derek was doing, all of it, the messages, the hearing time, the call to Richard, was not the behavior of a man who was confident. It was the behavior of a man who was terrified, and the thing he was terrified of was not losing in court. He had already accepted that as a real possibility. What terrified him was the email, 6 words, Claire knows. Clean it up now, 6 words that did not just damage his civil claim. 6 words that demonstrated he had known about the fraud and had attempted to conceal it. 6 words that transformed a business dispute into something considerably more serious. Derek didn't care about the injunction anymore. He was trying to stop the underlying investigation. She understood that completely now. She set her phone down. She did not write back. The priority approach vector was approved. The Gulfstream touched down at 8:08. A black SUV was waiting on the tarmac. Alexander had arranged it from the aircraft, and the driver had the route already mapped, already tracking the real-time traffic on every possible corridor between the airport and the courthouse. Alexander walked down the aircraft stairs beside her. She had not expected that. "You don't need to come," she said. "I know," he said. He got into the vehicle. She got in after him. The driver said the fastest current route was showing 31 minutes. There was a surface road alternative that might be faster depending on a light rail crossing they couldn't predict. He was monitoring both. 31 minutes, 8:09. 9 o'clock hearing, 51 minutes. That was actually possible. They moved through the airport corridor, and for several minutes nobody spoke. The city was waking up around them, morning commuters, delivery vehicles, the particular density of a Monday morning when every road carried the weight of a week that was just beginning. Alexander broke the silence. "When this is over," he said, not looking at her, watching the traffic ahead, "I want to talk to you about a new structure inside Kane Capital. A division focused on overlooked assets and undercapitalized founders." Claire looked at him. "It would require significant analytical leadership," he said. "Someone who understands value that isn't immediately visible." She understood what he was doing. He was not reassuring her. He was not managing her anxiety. He was doing what he always did, operating on the assumption that the current problem was already solved, and moving to what came next. "How much capital?" she asked. "Initial commitment of $100 million. Timeline for the first deployment. 18 months. She thought about it. The traffic light ahead turned red. "I want input on the first selection criteria," she said. "Expected," he said. The light turned green. They kept moving. At 8:47, the courthouse was 2 blocks ahead, and the driver said, with a professionalism that only barely concealed his relief, that they had made it. Then the traffic stopped, completely. A delivery truck had stalled in the intersection ahead. A traffic officer was on foot trying to direct cars around it, but the combination of the truck and the pedestrian crossing timing had created a gridlock that was moving at approximately 1 car length per 90 seconds. Claire looked at the clock, 8:48. She looked at the courthouse through the windshield. She could see the steps. She could see people moving up them. She did the math. 1 car length per 90 seconds was not going to get her there. She looked at her heels. She looked at the evidence case in her lap. She thought about 11 years of waiting for the right moment, the right permission, the right person to tell her she was allowed to move. She opened the door, Claire Alexander's voice. She looked back at him. He was watching her with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not concern, something more complex than concern. The expression of a man who had spent a professional lifetime being the most capable person in a given situation and was watching someone else be that person and finding the experience unexpectedly moving. "I've spent 11 years, she said, waiting for other people to decide when I could start." She looked at the courthouse. "I'm done waiting," she said. She removed her heel. She picked up the evidence case and she ran. The people on the sidewalk turned to look. Some of them moved aside when they saw the expression on her face, not fear, not desperation, but the focused forward momentum of a woman with a specific destination, and no patience left for anything that stood between her and it. She ran across the plaza in her stockinged feet, the evidence case in one hand, her heels in the other, her ivory suit in the morning air and the sound of the city around her. And she did not slow down, and she did not look back, and she hit the courthouse doors at 8:56. 4 minutes, she put her heels on in the security line while the officer checked her bag. She straightened her jacket while she waited for the elevator. She smoothed her hair with one hand on the ride up to the 4th floor. The courtroom doors were closed. She could hear voices inside. She pulled the left door open. The voices stopped. 30 faces turned toward her. Derek Whitmore, sitting beside Howard Pike at the plaintiff's table, had been mid-sentence. He stopped speaking. His mouth stayed open for a half-second in a way that would have been almost funny under any other circumstances. His attorney was speaking before Derek could recover. Your Honor, the defendant's arrival at this time, given the circumstances of Miss Monroe, the judge, a woman in her late 50s named the Honorable Patricia Gallo, spoke without looking up from her notes. Is your client present? Rachel Monroe stood. She had been sitting at the defense table with an expression of absolute calm that Claire knew, from a decade of friendship, represented the most extreme form of Rachel's inner discipline. She is, Your Honor, Rachel said. She looked at Claire. Claire walked to the defense table. She set the evidence case down. She pulled out her chair. She sat. Rachel leaned toward her and said, very quietly, with 4 months of stress packed into 6 words, "Where the hell did you come from?" Claire reached into the evidence case and removed the first document. San Francisco, she said. She set the document on the table in front of her. She looked across at Derek Whitmore. He was staring at her. Ivory suit, evidence case, heels back on, not a single breath of hesitation in posture or her face. Talked back at him, with the steady, unter expression of a woman who had closed a billion-dollar deal at 3 a.m, boarded a private jet and run barefoot across a courthouse plaza, and was now finally exactly where she had been planning to be. By way of Alexander Cain's jet, she said. The courtroom had not yet understood what was about to happen to it. But Claire Whitmore had. She had understood for months. Judge Patricia Gallo was the kind of woman who had spent 30 years on the bench developing an instinct for the difference between a legal argument and a performance, and she applied that instinct now as she looked at the plaintiff's table, then at the defense table, then at the woman who had just walked through her courtroom doors with an evidence case in one hand and her shoes in the other. She said nothing about the entrance. She simply said, "We'll begin." Howard Pike stood immediately. He was a tall man with silver hair and the practiced confidence of an attorney who had won enough high-profile cases to have developed a specific relationship with his own voice. He used it the way a conductor used a baton, deliberately aware of its effect on a room. "Your Honors," he said, "the plaintiff has filed this emergency motion because the evidence will show that Claire Whitmore, during the final months of her marriage to Derek Whitmore, systematically accessed confidential financial information belonging to Whitmore Development Group, information she then removed from the marital home, shared with Cain Capital Partners, and used to orchestrate a coordinated campaign of reputational and financial damage against her former husband and his company." He paused for exactly the right amount of time. "What this court will also find," he continued, "is that Ms. Whitmore's sudden reappearance in Charlotte's business community on the arm of one of the city's most prominent investors was not a coincidence. It was a strategy built on stolen information, personal bitterness, and the calculated use of a powerful man's resources to pursue a vendetta she could not pursue us in her own." The word vendetta landed in the room with the specific weight of a word chosen for its emotional impact rather than its precision. Claire did not react. She was looking at the notepad in front of her, writing 2 words, Thomas Garrett. She underlined them. She passed the notepad to Rachel. Rachel glanced at it, nodded once, wrote something underneath, and passed it back. "Already handled. Subpoena served at 7 this morning." Howard Pike spoke for 22 minutes. He was good. Claire acknowledged that without heat. He built his narrative with genuine craft, the picture of a bitter woman who had signed away everything in a divorce settlement and then, rather than accepting the outcome, had leveraged a vulnerable emotional state to attach herself to a powerful benefactor who had given her both resources and motivation to destroy what she'd walked away from. He used the phrase Cain Capital's weapon twice. He used the phrase coordinated campaign 4 times. He described Claire's work at Cain Capital not as professional achievement, but as proximity to power, a woman who had found a new man to stand behind, whose analytical contributions were actually just the careful deployment of information she had no right to possess. It was a precisely constructed argument. It was also built on a foundation that Claire had spent 3 months quietly excavating. When Howard Pike sat down, Rachel Monroe stood. Rachel was not a tall woman. She was compact, precise, with dark eyes that missed very little, and a voice that never rose above the register of absolute control. She had been Claire's attorney for the divorce, and before that she had been Claire's friend for 14 years, and she understood, better than almost anyone alive, exactly what the woman sitting beside her had been through. She did not show any of that in the courtroom, she showed only the argument. "Your Honor," Rachel said, "the plaintiff's characterization of my client is creative. It's also directly contradicted by every piece of verifiable evidence in this proceeding." She picked up the first document from the table. "We will demonstrate today that Claire Whitmore's investigation into Whitmore Development Group's financial irregularities was conducted entirely through public records, commercially available research platforms, and legally obtained forensic analysis commissioned through proper channels. We will demonstrate that no confidential information was removed from the marital home. We will demonstrate that the plaintiff's own communications, his own words, establish not only that he was aware of the irregularities my client Sipistis discovered, but that he took active steps to conceal them the moment he understood they had been found." She set the document down. And finally, Rachel said, "We will demonstrate that the emergency injunction Mr. Whitmore is seeking today is not, as represented, a good-faith effort to protect legitimate business interests. It is an attempt to use this court to silence the one person whose professional expertise and personal knowledge placed her in a position to see what Mr. Whitmore and his associates had spent 3 years hiding." She sat down. Judge Gallo looked at both tables. "Mr. Pike," she said, "call your first witness." Thomas Garrett took the stand at 9:34. He was 32, with the slightly over-rehearsed composure of someone who had been coached extensively and was working to make that coaching invisible. He settled into the witness chair and looked at Howard Pike with the careful attentiveness of a man following instructions. Howard Pike walked him through his background, methodically his education, his time at Kane Capital, his role as an analyst, his departure. Then he moved to the central allegation. "During your time at Kane Capital," Howard said, "did you ever receive a request from Claire Whitmore to access financial data related to Whitmore Development Group?" "Yes," Thomas said. "Describe that request." "She asked me to pull a comprehensive data package on commercial development projects in the Charlotte market. She specifically asked for financial performance data, development cost benchmark, and subcontractor payment records." "And where did you obtain that data?" "Through a third-party aggregation service that Kane Capital subscribed to." "Was that service limited to publicly available information?" Thomas paused. It was a small pause, barely perceptible, but Claire had been watching his face since he sat down, and she caught it. "The service aggregated data from multiple sources," Thomas said. "Some of it was public record. Some of it came from proprietary commercial databases. And to your knowledge, did those proprietary databases include information that Whitmore Development had not made publicly available?" "It's possible," Thomas said. "I don't have full visibility into every data source the aggregator used." Howard Pike nodded with satisfaction. Rachel stood. "Objection, Your Honor. The witness has just testified that he doesn't know what sources the aggregator used. His speculation about what those sources may or may not have included is not evidence." "Sustained," Judge Gallo said. Mr. Pike, move on. Howard moved on, but he had planted the implication, which was what he had wanted to do. Claire wrote one line on her notepad and pushed it to Rachel. "Ask him about the subscription tier." Rachel looked at it. She underlined it. When Rachel stood for cross-examination, she started somewhere Thomas Garrett had not been prepared for her to start. "Mr. Garrett," she said pleasantly, "you testified that Kane Capital subscribed to a third-party data aggregation service. Is that correct?" "Yes." "Do you recall the name of that service?" He named it. "And are you familiar with the different subscription tiers that service offers?" "A beat. Generally. I'm going to show you what's been marked as Defense Exhibit 7. Rachel's assistant placed a document in front of Thomas. "This is Kane Capital's subscription contract with that service, including the specific tier and data access level they maintain during the period relevant to your testimony. Can you read for the court what access level is specified?" Thomas looked at the document. He read it. "Public Records, Aggregation, and Commercial Market Analysis Tier," he said. "Which tier includes proprietary non-public data access?" Another pause. Longer this time. "The Enterprise tier," he said. "And what tier was Kane Capital subscribed to during the period in question?" Thomas looked at the document again. "Standard tier," he said, "which is described in the contract as, and I'll read directly, aggregated publics, government filings, county property records, state business filings, and published market data." "Is that what it says?" "Yes," Thomas said. Quietly, "so the data Claire Whitmore asked you to pull came from a service that At the subscription level Kane Capital maintained, had access only to public records. Howard Pike was on his feet. Objection, counsel is testifying. I'm asking a question, Rachel said. Mr. Garrett, based on what you've just read, the subscription tier, the data access levels specified in the contract, is it accurate to say that the aggregation service Claire Whitmore asked you to use had access only to publicly available data? Thomas looked at Howard Pike. Howard Pike could not help him. He was looking at the document. Based on this contract, Thomas said carefully. Yes, thank you, Rachel said. Nothing further. Thomas Garrett stepped down from the stand, looking like a man who understood, for the first time, that the attorneys who had prepared him had not fully prepared him. Howard Pike called 2 more witnesses, an IT director from Whitmore Development who testified about the credential access issue, a financial consultant who offered an opinion about the alleged harm to Whitmore Development's business relationships. Rachel methodically dismantled both. She produced Derek's text messages directing Claire to maintain system access through the end of October, the messages Claire had sent from the plane the previous night. She showed the IT director's own access logs confirming no unusual query activity during the relevant period. She established that the financial consultant had never reviewed the underlying evidence that had prompted Kane Capital's withdrawal from port. At 11:15, Howard Pike said he had no further witnesses. Judge Gallo looked at Rachel Monroe. Miss Monroe, your case, Rachel called Claire to the stand. This was the moment Derek had been waiting for. Claire could see it in the way he straightened slightly in his chair, the way Howard Pike picked up his pen with a specific readiness. They believed that putting Claire on the stand under cross-examination was their best remaining opportunity. A woman who had been emotionally damaged by a difficult divorce, confronting the man who had humiliated her in a public courtroom, they believed emotion would do what their witnesses had failed to do. They had never understood that Claire Whitmore's greatest professional strength had always been her ability to operate with complete clarity, under exactly the kind of pressure that caused other people to become emotional. Rachel walked her through the investigation step by step. The public records, the county filings, the Blue Cedar discovery, the corporate chain to TerraPath to Calvin Mercer's trust, the forensic team's independent verification, the subcontractor bankruptcy records. Claire answered every question in the same register, precise, specific, grounded. She did not editorialize. She did not express anger or satisfaction. She stated facts, identified sources, and explained methodology. At one point, Judge Gallo interrupted with a question of her own. Miss Whitmore, she said, the chain you've described, Blue Cedar to TerraPath to the Mercer family. Trust, how confident are you in that connection? And on what basis? The connection is documented through Secretary of State business filings, trust instruments in the Delaware Public Record, and registered agent disclosures, Claire said. Each step of the chain is supported by a specific document in the evidence binder. The forensic team's independent analysis, which I was not a part of but which I can speak to methodologically, confirmed the same connections through parallel research. The judge looked at the evidence binder on Rachel's table. How many documents are we talking about? The relevant exhibits are pages 47 through 112, Claire said. Judge Gallo wrote something down, then Howard Pike stood for cross-examination. He started with the divorce. Miss Whitmore, you signed a divorce settlement in which you voluntarily no financial compensation from your husband's company, correct? And at the time you signed that settlement, you had already begun investigating Whitmore Development's finances. I had begun reviewing publicly available information. Yes. Information you had accessed using professional databases you became aware of through your position at Kane Capital, a position you obtained after the divorce was filed. The information I reviewed was available to any member of the public. I used it more efficiently than most people would, because of my professional background. Your professional background, Howard repeated. Let's talk about that. Before your recent position at Kane Capital, your last formal employment was 11 years ago. Correct? My last externally compensated employment was 11 years ago. My actual work during that period was extensive. Work you did without compensation. Work I did without separate compensation. Yes, work you did for your husband's company. Work I did for the company I helped build, which was structured as my husband's company. And when that company no longer needed your unpaid contribution, Rachel stood. Objection. Assumes facts not in evidence and mischaracterizes the witness's testimony. Sustained. Mr. Pike, rephrase. Howard Pike looked at Claire. He shifted direction. Isn't it true, he said, that everything you've done since leaving Charlotte joining Kane Capital Investigating Whitmore development, providing evidence to regulatory authorities is motivated by personal former husband? Claire looked at him for a moment. No, she said. You have no personal feelings about what happened in your marriage. I have feelings about what happened in my marriage, Claire said. I also have feelings about what Derek did with the money that belonged to Whitmore Development's creditors and investors. Those are separate things. I acted on the second one. You acted on it, Howard repeated. Despite the fact that you had no formal role at Whitmore Development. Despite the fact that you had signed away any claim to the company. Despite the fact that the most reasonable interpretation of your behavior is that a woman scorned by her husband and that used a powerful new employer to pursue revenge. The most reasonable interpretation, Claire Plex said, is supported by evidence. Every conclusion I reached is documented in public filings. Every step of the investigation is traceable. If my motivation were personal, the methodology would look different. Personal revenge is sloppy. What I built was not sloppy. Howard Pike stared at her for a moment. Then he sat down. Claire returned to the defense table. Rachel leaned toward her and said nothing. She simply put her hand briefly on Claire's arm and then withdrew it and picked up her pen. Rachel called Sandra Voss next. Sandra Voss was 51, with the precise economy of movement that characterized people who spent their professional lives working with numbers. She took the stand and identified herself as the lead forensic accountant on the independent review, commissioned through Kane Capital's legal counsel. She was not there to be dramatic. She was there to explain, clearly and without embellishment, what $31 million looked like when it moved through a structure designed to be invisible. She explained it clearly and without embellishment. She walked Judge Gallo through the Blue Cedar payment records, the TerraPath structure, the trust instrument, Calvin Mercer's position as investment director. She explained how the inflated construction budgets had created the financial space within which the payments could be as obscured. She explained how the same inflated figures had then appeared in loan applications submitted to lenders, and what that meant for the validity of approximately 94 development financing that Whitmore Development had secured over 3 years. Howard Pike objected 11 times during Sandra's testimony. Judge Gallo sustained 2 of the objections, the other 9. She overruled. At one point, Howard Pike stood and said, "With considerable force, Your Honor, the witness is speculating about the intentions of parties who are not defendants in this proceeding. The court should not permit a fishing expedition into Miss Pike," Judge Gallo said with a patience that was clearly finite. "The witness is a qualified forensic accountant describing documented financial transactions. She has been careful to distinguish between what the documents show and what she infers from them. That is not speculation, that is analysis." She looked at Sandra. Sandra continued. Across the room, Calvin Mercer, who had been sitting in the gallery since 9 o'clock in a gray suit with the frozen expression of a man who had been advised by his own attorney to display nothing, shifted in his seat for the first time. Claire noticed. She wrote one word on her notepad. Watching. She underlined it. She was watching Calvin Mercer watch Sandra Voss systematically describe the structure he had built and inhabited for 3 years, and what she saw on his face was not the expression of a man who believed he was going to be exonerated. It was the expression of a man doing arithmetic. Sandra Voss stepped down at 12:40. Judge Gallo called a 15-minute recess. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Rachel pulled Claire aside and spoke quickly and quietly. "Howard Pike is going to call for a continuance," she said. "He's going to argue that the forensic evidence is too voluminous for meaningful cross-examination in a single session and request additional time. Can he get it? Possibly. Judge Gallo has some discretion. But the injunction request cuts against a long continuance. You can't operate professionally while it's pending, and Gallo knows that." Rachel paused. "I want to go to the email immediately after the recess." "Before he has time to file anything, do it," Claire said. "It's going to change the temperature of the room," Rachel said. "Significantly." "I know, Derek may react." Claire looked through the courtroom doors. She could see the back of Derek's head at the plaintiff's table. He was leaning toward Howard Pike, and his posture had the rigid quality of a man whose body had caught up to something his mind was still resisting. "Let him," Claire said. Rachel looked at her for a moment. "You know," Rachel said quietly, "I've known you for 14 years. I've seen you in a lot of difficult situations." She paused. "I've never seen you like this." "Like what?" "Like someone who has absolutely nothing left to lose." She corrected herself immediately. "No, that's not right. Like someone who has finally figured out what they actually have and decided it's enough." Claire was quiet for a moment. "Go get the email ready," she said. Rachel went. The recess ended at 1:03. Howard Pike stood before Judge Gallo could speak. "Your Honor, Given the volume and complexity of the forensic testimony introduced this morning, the plaintiff requests a continuance to denied, Judge Gallo said. Ms. Monroe, continue. Howard Pike sat down. His face did not change expression, but something behind his eyes recalibrated. Rachel stood. Your Honor, I'd like to introduce Defense Exhibit 31. She walked to the evidence table and picked up a single printed page. One page in a binder full of hundreds. She placed a copy in front of Howard Pike. She placed a copy in front of Judge Gallo. She walked back to the defense table and looked at the room. Defense Exhibit 31 is an email obtained from the public record of the Coastal Builders bankruptcy proceeding, case number CV 2024-4471, filed in the Eastern District of North Carolina. The email was included as Exhibit J in the bankruptcy trustee's evidentiary filing and is therefore a matter of public court record. She paused. It is a message sent from the personal email account of Derek Whitmore to Calvin Mercer on November 19th of last year. The room was very quiet. It contains 6 words, Rachel said. She read them. Claire knows. Clean it up now. She set the document down. She lets the 6 words sit in the air of the courtroom for several seconds. Undisturbed, Howard Pike was already on his feet. Your Honor, the plaintiff objects strenuously to the characterization of this document. The email is ambiguous. It's being taken out of context, and the defense is attempting to introduce Mr. Judge Gallo's voice was not raised. It didn't need to be. I can read. Sit down. Howard Pike sat down. The judge read the email. She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at the room with an expression that had shifted not toward anger, not toward theatrics, but toward the particular focused seriousness of a judge who had just watched a proceeding change shape in front of her. Ms. Monroe, she said, walk me through the timeline. Rachel walked her through it. Kane Capital withdrew from Ravenport on November 16th. The email was dated November 19th. 3 days after the withdrawal, Derek Whitmore had sent a 6-word message to his chief financial officer instructing him to conceal something. Claire knows, the judge said, repeating the words aloud in a way that suggested she was testing their weight. What does the plaintiff contend Claire knows refers to? Howard Pike stood. Your Honor, in context, the plaintiff was referring to, I'm asking. Monroe. Howard Pike sat. The plaintiff contends, Rachel said, or will likely contend, that Derek Whitmore was referring to some other matter entirely. That Claire knows was a reference to a personal dispute, perhaps, or a business concern unrelated to the financial irregularities the forensic evidence describes. She paused. The defense contends that the only reasonable reading of a message sent to the company's CFO, 3 days after a major investment firm withdrew from a flagship project, using the word clean as an imperative, is that Derek Whitmore knew his CFO had done something that needed to be hidden, and that he knew Claire Whitmore had discovered it. The room stayed quiet. Derek was looking at the table in front of him. Not at Claire, not at the judge, at the table, and Claire, watching him, recognized something she had not seen on Derek Whitmore's face in 11 years of marriage. He looked small, not diminished by anyone else's action, not reduced by the room or the judge or the words being spoken, simply small. The way a person looked when the story they had been telling themselves about who they were could no longer bear the weight of the evidence against it. She did not feel triumph. She felt something much quieter, something closer to grief, not for Derek, but for the 11 years she had spent believing that his version of her was the accurate one. She looked away. Howard Pike asked for 10 minutes. Judge Gallo gave him 5. He huddled with Derek in a corner of the room that was technically private but practically observed by everyone present. Claire did not try to read what they were saying. She talked quietly with Rachel, reviewing the remaining exhibits, making sure the documentary chain was airtight before the afternoon session could begin. At 1:22, Howard Pike returned to the plaintiff's table. He did not look at Claire. He addressed the judge. Your Honor, he said, the plaintiff wishes to withdraw the request for emergency injunction. The room shifted. Rachel went completely still beside Claire. The plaintiff, Howard Pike continued, with the careful diction of a man delivering words he was not personally comfortable with, acknowledges that the basis for the injunction request has been materially affected by the evidence presented today and does not wish to burden the court with a motion that cannot be sustained on its current evidentiary foundation. Judge Gallo looked at him for a long moment. The injunction request is withdrawn, she said. What is the plaintiff's position on the underlying civil claims? Another pause. The plaintiff requests a brief period to evaluate the claims in light of today's proceedings, Howard said. You have 72 hours, Judge Gallo said. Monroe, does the defense wish to be heard on the emergency motions? Rachel stood. Yes, Your Honor, she said. The defense requests that the court note for the record that the plaintiff's emergency motions were filed with the apparent purpose of creating professional disruption during a critical business period, specifically by scheduling a hearing time that required my client to choose between her professional obligations and her legal defense. We are not seeking sanctions at this time, but we ask the court to consider that history in the event the plaintiff files further motions. Judge Gallo wrote something down. Noted, she said. Court is in recess. The room stood with her, and that was it. Not a verdict. Not a gavel coming down on a dramatic declaration. Not the triumphant resolution that movies suggested courtroom victories looked like. Just a judge rising from her chair and a room standing, and the particular specific sound of a proceeding that had ceased to function as Derek Whitmore had designed it to function. The hallway outside the courtroom was a different kind of chaos than the one Claire had prepared for. She had prepared for reporters. She had prepared for questions she would decline to answer, for the managed calm of a person who had won and chose not to perform winning. She had prepared her one sentence and she delivered it when the first microphone appeared in front of her face. The evidence should speak louder than I do. Then she walked. The reporters called questions after her. She did not stop. Rachel walked beside her, and Alexander, who had been sitting in the gallery for the last 3 hours without Claire knowing, which she discovered when she saw him standing near the corridor exit, fell into step on her other side. She looked at him. He looked back at her. He said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the morning hadn't already said more clearly than words could. They walked through the building and out into the afternoon and into the car. For several minutes nobody spoke. Then Alexander said, "The Pacific Meridian team called during the recess. Richard Langford wants to schedule a call with you specifically. He said, and I'm quoting him directly, that he wants to discuss the due diligence process with someone who actually understands it." Claire looked out the window. He also said, Alexander continued, in exactly the same tone, that whoever called him Sunday night did so from a number registered to a Whitmore Development Group subsidiary. Claire absorbed that. "You have it documented," she said. "Richard's counsel sent it this morning." She nodded. The car moved through the Charlotte street she had known for 11 years, past buildings and intersections that carried 11 years of memory in their faces, and she watched them without the particular ache she had expected to feel. They were just buildings now, just intersections, a city she had lived in that was no longer the city she lived in. "Rachel," she said. Rachel, sitting beside her, looked up from her phone. "The concealed assets from the marriage," Claire said. "The financial disclosures show Derek hid funds in the Terapath structure that predated the divorce filing. That means the settlement agreement was signed based on incomplete financial disclosure." "Yes," Rachel said carefully. "I want to recover what's legally mine, not the mansion. Not the cars, not anything that came from the company after I left. But what can be traced to funds I contributed before the marriage, my inheritance, my documented premarital capital, and anything he concealed that belongs properly to the settlement." Rachel was already writing. "Not a dollar more than what the law says is mine," Claire said. "And I'm not going to fight for it publicly. I want it done quietly, through proper channels, and I want it done correctly." "That's the right approach," Rachel said. "I know," Claire said. She looked back out the window. Derek did not come out of the courthouse immediately. He stayed inside for 40 minutes after the recess, and when he finally emerged, the reporters who had been waiting got very little. Howard Pike said the plaintiff was evaluating his legal position. He said it with the careful blankness of an attorney managing a situation that had moved beyond the range of his preferred outcomes. Derek said nothing. He got into his car. Vanessa was not there. She had stopped returning his calls 2 days earlier, when the news about the regulatory inquiry into Whitmore Development had begun to circulate in Charlotte's business community. She had not called since. Calvin Mercer had called his attorney from the gallery before Judge Gallo had even risen from her chair. 2 of Whitmore Development's lenders had already requested emergency financial reviews by the time Derek reached his car. The Charlotte Business Journal had a reporter working on a story that would appear the following morning with details that had been sourced through, among other things, the public court filings from that day's proceedings. Derek did not know most of this yet. He would know it by evening. But sitting in the back of his car outside the courthouse, staring at his phone, he knew the shape of it. He had always been good at reading the shape of things. It was, ironically, one of the qualities that had made him successful for as long as he had been successful. He understood, before the calls started coming, that the morning had not just cost him a lawsuit, it had cost him the story. The story he had spent 11 years constructing, the self-made man, The visionary developer, the brilliant founder, who had built something from nothing, was now competing with a different story. A better documented one, and stories about financial fraud, once they started, did not stop, because the person at the center of them wanted them to. He called Claire. She didn't answer. He called again. She still didn't answer. He put his phone in his pocket and looked out the window at the city he had spent 11 years building a reputation in, and he felt the particular cold of a man who was beginning to understand that a reputation, unlike a building, could not be restructured. It could only collapse or hold. His was collapsing. 3 days later, Claire was back in Atlanta. She was sitting in her office at Kane Capital at 7 in the morning, reviewing the preliminary integration documents for Pacific Meridian. When Rachel called, Calvin Mercer took a plea. Rachel said. Claire put down her pen. Cooperation agreement. Rachel continued. Full disclosure of the financial structure, all communications, every account and transaction. His attorney negotiated it yesterday. The announcement is going public this morning. Does he implicate Derek directly? Fully. A pause. Claire, there are communications between Derek and Calvin going back 27 months. Derek wasn't just aware of the structure. He approved the initial setup. He received regular summaries of the fund flows. He knew exactly what was happening and exactly where the money was going. The office was quiet. He knew, Claire said. Not a question. A confirmation of something she had understood intellectually but was only now receiving as documented fact. He knew, Rachel said, from the beginning. Claire looked out the glass wall at the city below. She thought about the kitchen table where she had built financial models while Derek read them over her shoulder and then presented them to investors as his own thinking. She thought about the recession year and the 72 sleepless hours and the debt restructuring that saved the company. She thought about charity dinners and industry forums and 11 years of stepping back so he could step forward. She thought about a conference table and 6 words. She thought about his hand on her wrist. She thought about his laughter when she walked away. She let herself feel all of it for exactly as long as it needed to be felt. Then she picked up her pen. Thank you, Rachel, she said. There's one more thing, Rachel said. Tell me, the concealed asset recovery. Derek's new counsel reached out this morning. They want to negotiate a quiet settlement rather than litigate the disclosure issue in court. They're offering to return what's documentably yours plus a reasonable figure for whatever the law says is mine, Claire said. Not $1 more, not $1 less. Tell them if they want a quiet process. They need to be fair. If they want to litigate, I'm prepared. I'll tell them, Rachel. Yes? Thank you, Claire said again, this time with a different weight in it. Rachel was quiet for a moment. You did the work, Claire. All I did was show up to court. You showed up ready, Claire said. That's not nothing. She hung up. She turned back to the Pacific Meridian documents. She worked. 2 weeks after the courtroom, Alexander called her into the boardroom. This was not unusual. Alexander called people into the boardroom regularly. It was where he conducted business, made decisions, and had the conversations that mattered. Claire had been in that room dozens of times. But she had not been in it with the full board present. 8 people around the table. Senior partners, 2 outside directors, the head of operations, Alexander at the head, an empty chair at his right hand, which was where he directed her to sit. She sat. He did not preamble. He was not a man who preambled. He slid a document across the table. Managing partner, special situations and infrastructure, he said. Effective immediately. Claire looked at the document. She looked at the 8 people around the table. She had understood, at flight back from San Francisco, that Alexander had mentioned the new division as a signal. She had not understood that the signal was this. The Pacific Meridian Board specifically requested your oversight of the integration, Alexander said. That's a 1-year process minimum with significant capital deployment decisions. It requires a managing partner's authority, not a director's. He paused. You've also built something in the past 6 months that my senior team hasn't been able to build in 3 years. A methodology for identifying value that isn't immediately legible. He looked at her. That's not an analyst's job. That's a partner's job. One of the outside directors leaned forward. Ms. Whitmore, we want to be clear that this offer is not connected to the recent publicity around your former husband's legal situation. It's connected to your work product, which speaks for itself. The courtroom was incidental. I understand that, Claire said. She looked at the document. She thought about what it had cost her to be sitting in this chair. Not in terms of loss, not the mansion, not the settlement, not the 11 years, but in terms of what she had built to get here. The 14-hour days, the mistakes Alexander had torn apart. The 87 pages at 6 in the morning. The negotiating table at 3 in the morning. The courthouse plaza in her stockinged feet. She thought about what she had been before all of that, when she had been standing in Derek's shadow, convincing herself that contributing without credit was enough. She picked up the pen, she signed, and this time when the pen touched the paper, she felt nothing like what she had felt in that conference room 11 years ago, when she had signed the document that started her career. She felt no anxiety, no hope deferred, no question about whether the person across the table would value what she brought. She felt simply certain the board members signed their copies. Alexander signed his. He looked at her. "There's one more item," he said. He slid a second document across. "The division requires a name," he said. "For branding purposes, for client communications. For the market," he looked at her. "I'd like it to be yours." Claire looked at the document, at the blank line where a name would go. She thought about a woman who had spent 11 years being Derek Whitmore's wife. She thought about what it had felt like to have her own name fade until it barely registered in the rooms she occupied. She wrote 2 words on the line, "Claire Whitmore." "That'll do," Alexander said. He closed his folder. Outside the boardroom glass, Charlotte spread in every direction, the city she had left and returned to, the city where she had signed away everything and built something from the nothing she had walked away with. She had not taken half of Derek Whitmore's empire. She had done something he would never fully understand. She had built a name that was entirely, irrevocably, and only hers, and that, she thought, was the thing that had always terrified him most. Not that she would take what he had, but that she would prove she never needed it. The managing partner contract had been signed for exactly 9 days when Claire Whitmore received a phone call she had not anticipated. It was not from Derek. Derek's calls had stopped the morning Calvin Mercer's cooperation agreement went public. It was not from Rachel, who had settled into a rhythm of weekly updates that were becoming progressively shorter as the legal situation resolved itself with the methodical inevitability of a process that had been properly built. It was from a woman named Diane Cho. Diane was 40, a former architect who had spent 7 years building a sustainable construction consultancy in Raleigh, from a 2-person operation into a firm with 30 employees and a client list that included several mid-sized municipalities across the Carolinas. She had been referred to Kane Capital by a regional bank that had declined her loan application for the 3rd time in 18 months. The bank's stated reason each time was insufficient collateral relative to the loan size. The actual reason, as best Diane could determine, was that the loan officer had looked at her firm's financials, looked at Diane, and made a calculation about risk that had more to do with what he expected her firm to be than what her firm's numbers actually showed. "I've been told my growth projections are too aggressive," Diane said on the phone. "But they're based on contracted revenue. I have signed agreements. I'm not projecting, I'm reporting." "Send me everything," Claire said. "Financial statements, the contracts, the loan applications, the bank's written responses. All of it. You'll look at it? I'll look at it today." Diane sent the documents within the hour. Claire looked at them within the hour after that. By the time she had finished reading, she was already dialing Peter Shu's extension. "Clear your afternoon," she said when he answered. "I have something I need you to run numbers on. The Pacific Meridian integration, new project," she said. "And Peter, this one matters." The documents Diane had sent told a story that Claire recognized with the specific recognition of a person who had lived a version of it herself. Not the same version. Diane's situation was operationally different from Claire's. She was running an independent firm, not disappearing inside a husband's company. But the underlying dynamic was identical. A woman whose actual work products significantly exceeded what the people evaluating her were willing to credit her for. Numbers that were real, being dismissed by people who had decided in advance what those numbers were allowed to mean. The firm was called Groundwork Sustainable Construction, and it had, over 7 years, developed a niche that was becoming increasingly valuable, retrofitting existing commercial buildings for efficiency compliance under evolving state and federal environmental regulations. It was specialized work. It required technical expertise most construction firms didn't have. And it was positioned in a market that was about to become significantly larger as regulatory timelines tightened. Diane's growth projections were not aggressive. They were, if anything, conservative. Claire finished the analysis at 6:15 in the evening and sat back from her desk. She thought about what Alexander had said on the flight back from San Francisco. $100 million, 18 months for the first deployment. A division focused on overlooked assets and undercapitalized founders. She thought about Diane Cho on the phone, asking with careful hope whether Claire would actually look at it. She picked up her phone and called Alexander. He answered on the 3rd ring. "Groundwork Sustainable Construction," she said. "Raleigh-based. 7 years operating 30 employees, contracted revenue pipeline of $8 million for the next 14 months. Bank rejected their growth financing 3 times, a pause. Why the loan officer didn't believe the projections were real, are they? They're understated, Claire said. The regulatory tailwind in their specific niche is going to accelerate significantly in the next 18 to 24 months. The founder built the firm's methodology specifically for compliance retrofitting, which is a skill set that's currently scarce and about to become critically scarce. She's not asking for money to grow into a market. She's asking for money to keep up with a market that's already growing around her. Another pause. Longer this time. What are you recommending? Alexander said. A structured equity investment, not a loan. She doesn't need debt, she needs a capital partner who understands the difference between a projection and a commitment. Claire paused. This is exactly the kind of situation the new division exists for. Bring it to me Tuesday, Alexander said. I'll bring it to you Monday, Claire said, a brief silence. Monday, Alexander said. He hung up. Claire called Diane Cho back. I've reviewed everything, Claire said. I want to bring this to my partners. Can you be in Atlanta on Monday? The silence on the other end of the line lasted about 4 seconds. Yes, Diane said. Her voice had a quality in it that Claire recognized, the specific quality of a person who has been told no so many times that yes requires a moment to process. Absolutely, yes. Bring the contracts, Claire said. All of them. And bring the regulatory timeline documentation. I'll need to show my partners exactly what the compliance window looks like. I'll have everything ready, Diane said. After she hung up, Claire sat for a moment in the quiet of the office. The city was settling into evening outside the glass wall. She was thinking about a woman in Raleigh who had built something real and true and valuable, who had been told 3 times by a person with institutional authority that what she had built wasn't good enough and who had kept building anyway. She understood that woman completely. She went home and she slept for 7 hours, which was the longest she had slept in 3 months. Monday's presentation lasted 40 minutes. Diane Cho sat at one end of the Kane Capital conference table in a navy blazer, and she was nervous visibly, genuinely nervous in the way that people were nervous when something they had built over 7 years was being evaluated by people with the power to either resource it or dismiss it. Claire had told her on the phone that the best thing she could do was answer questions directly and let the numbers essentially speak, and Diane had taken that advice with the literalness of an engineer. She had organized the numbers into a document that was precise, sequential, and required almost no explanation because it was constructed so clearly that the story told itself. Alexander asked 4 questions. The 2 outside directors asked 6 between them. Peter Hsu, who had built the supporting analysis over the weekend, answered 2 technical questions about the regulatory timeline that Diane hadn't anticipated being asked, and answered them correctly. At the end, Alexander looked at Claire. Your recommendation, he said. $4 million in structured equity, Claire said. 15% stake, non-dilutive for 18 months, board observer seat for Kane Capital. If the first regulatory compliance cycle performs at or above the contracted revenue levels, which I believe it, will we have the right of first refusal on a follow-on investment? Alexander looked at Diane. Miss Cho, he said, do those terms work for you? Diane looked at Claire. Then she looked at Alexander. Yes, she said, they work. Then let's have counsel draft the term sheet, Alexander said. He stood. Miss Cho, your firm does good work in an area that's about to matter considerably more than most people currently understand. Welcome to Kane Capital's portfolio. He walked out. Diane looked at Claire. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then I came in here expecting to be told my growth model needed to be revised. It doesn't, Claire said. I know that. Diane's voice had something in it that was not quite motion, but adjacent to it the particular qualitative degree of a person who has been right about something for a long time and is only now being told by someone with authority that they were right. I've always known that. I just couldn't get anyone to look at it long enough to see it. That's what this division is for, Claire said. Diane looked at her for a moment. How did you end up here? Claire considered the question. She thought about an extend stay apartment with industrial carpet. She thought about a conference room on the 41st floor and a hand gripping her wrist. She thought about 87 pages of analysis and a chair moved to a conference table. She thought about a negotiating table at 3 in the morning and a courthouse plaza in her stockinged feet. I ended up here, Claire said, by refusing to end up anywhere else. The groundwork investment was the first. Over the following 4 months, Claire sourced and closed 7 more transactions through the division. A logistics firm in Birmingham whose founder had been systematically passed over for financing, despite a client list that included 2 Fortune 500 companies. a food technology company in Nashville led by a woman who had spent 6 years developing a preservation process that extended the shelf life of fresh produce, only to be told repeatedly that the market wasn't ready when what the market actually was ready for her specifically. A renewable materials manufacturer in Greenville whose operating metrics were exceptional, and whose founder spoke with a directness that made certain loan committees uncomfortable in ways they couldn't formally articulate. All of them had something in common with each other and with the woman evaluating them. They had been seen incorrectly, not unseen, not invisible. Seen incorrectly, assessed through a framework that was looking for something other than what they were, and finding them deficient by the standards of a category they didn't fit. Claire was not building a charitable fund. Every investment was evaluated with the same rigor that Kane Capital applied to anything. The numbers had to work, the strategy had to hold. The founder had to demonstrate the specific combination of operational command and intellectual flexibility that distinguished a business that would grow from a business that would stagnate. But she was looking for something in addition to the numbers. She was looking for the gap between what a business was and what the conventional financing market believed it was allowed to be. And she was finding again and again that gap was frequently where the actual value lived. Alexander reviewed her deal reports every 2 weeks. He had questions. He pushed back on assumptions. He rejected 2 early-stage proposals because the downside scenarios weren't properly modeled and told her to bring them back when the analysis was tighter. She brought them back tighter. He approved them. This was their rhythm: challenge, response, decision, no performance, no politics, no credit assigned to anyone but the work itself. It was the professional relationship she had spent 11 years in the wrong marriage failing to find. It was Rachel who told her about the gala. Not with any particular drama, Rachel called on a Tuesday afternoon in what had become their standing weekly check-in and mentioned it the way she mentioned most significant developments, which was directly and without ornament. The Charlotte Business Foundation is hosting its annual gala next month, Rachel said. They've announced the award recipients. You're one of them. Claire stopped typing. The Rising Impact Award, Rachel said, for contributions to regional economic development. The foundation specifically cited the Kane Capital Division and its investment in Groundwork, and 2 of the other portfolio companies based in the Carolinas. Claire was quiet for a moment. Did you know about this? She asked. Alexander nominated you, Rachel said. He didn't tell you? No. That sounds about right for Alexander, Rachel said. Claire looked at the wall. The Charlotte Business Foundation's gala was one of the events she had attended every year for the last 8 years of her marriage. She had sat at Derek's table. She had listened to Derek accept a civic leadership recognition in the 4th year. She had worn the appropriate dress and smiled at the appropriate people, and returned home in the appropriate silence. Now they were giving her an award. In the same room. Rachel, she said. I know, Rachel said. I know what you're going to say. I'm going to accept it, Claire said. A pause. That's not what I thought you were going to say. I'm going to accept it because the work deserves to be acknowledged. Not because I need a room full of people to tell me I succeeded, but because the companies I invested in deserve visibility, and if a gala can give them that, then showing up is the right thing to do. She paused. Will you come? I already RSVP'd, Rachel said. I RSVP'd the moment I saw your name on the list. Claire almost smiled. One more thing, Rachel said, in the particular tone that meant there was something she had been working up to saying. Tell me, Derek was on the foundation's corporate sponsor list, Rachel said. Whitmore Development has sponsored this gala for 6 consecutive years. His team reached out last week to withdraw the sponsorship. When did they withdraw? The day after your name was announced as a recipient. Claire thought about that. She thought about Derek sitting in a car outside a courthouse, staring at a phone, facing a city that was telling a different story about him than the one he had spent 11 years constructing. She felt nothing that resembled satisfaction. She felt something much quieter. Something that was almost compassion, not for what Derek had done, but for what it must be to be a person who responded to someone else's recognition by withdrawing from the room, who measured his own worth so entirely by other people's diminishment that he couldn't stay in a space where he was not the most significant presence. She had lived beside that person for 11 years. She understood, finally, that it had nothing to do with her. It had never had anything to do with her. Thank you for telling me, Claire said. She hung up. She went back to work. The gala was on a Friday evening in March. Claire wore dark green. She went alone. Not because there was no one to go with. Rachel was already at the venue, and David Cho from Kane Capital had offered to escort her as a colleague if she wanted company, but because she wanted to walk into that room herself. Not beside anyone, not introduced through anyone else's presence. Just herself, she arrived at 6:45. The room was the same room. Same hotel, same ballroom, same configured tables and soft lighting, and the particular ambient sound of several hundred people networking in formal clothes. She had stood in this room so many times that her body recognized it before her mind fully registered where she was. But the experience of standing in it was completely different. 3 separate people approached her before she reached the bar. Not to ask about her escort, not to congratulate her on being married to someone, to talk to her about the groundwork investment, about the regulatory compliance niche, about the division's investment thesis, and whether Kane Capital was considering expanding it into other regions. She talked to them, easily, specifically, with the confidence of someone who had done the work and could speak about it from the inside rather than from behind someone else. An executive she had known for years during her marriage approached her and said, "Simply, I owe you an apology." She looked at him. "I spent a long time watching you stand behind Derek at these things," he said, "and I never once stopped to wonder what you were actually doing. I assumed you were doing what everyone assumed you were doing." He paused. "I was wrong. You weren't the only one," Claire said. "Still," he said, "I should have looked more carefully." "Yes," she said. "You should have." He moved on. She moved on too. The award presentation was at 8:30. Claire sat at a table with Rachel, with Diane Cho, who had been invited as a guest of the division, and with 2 other founders whose companies had received Kane Capital investments in the previous quarter. When her name was called, she stood and walked to the podium with the particular awareness of a person, moving through a room that had witnessed an earlier, smaller version of themselves. The foundation's director said several things about the division's investment thesis and its regional economic impact. She mentioned Groundwork specifically. She mentioned 2 other companies by name. Then she handed Claire the award. Claire looked at it. She looked at the room. She had thought about what she would say. She had thought about it, and then she had decided that the person who needed to say something was not the person who had arrived at this gala on Derek's arm 8 years ago. That person had been careful, managed, had chosen every word for how it would land rather than for whether it was true. She was not that person anymore. 8 months ago, she said, "I signed divorce papers and left Charlotte with 2 suitcases and less than $3,000 in an account I could access." She paused. "I want to be clear about what happened next. Nobody rescued me. Nobody gave me an opportunity out of pity. I walked into a billionaire's office and told him his entire senior team had missed something. And I was right. The room was very quiet. The companies in the portfolio I manage now exist for one reason," she said. "Because the people who built them were right about their own work, and the systems around them weren't looking correctly." She looked at Diane Cho at the table. "That is not a small problem. It is a structural problem. And the only solution to a structural problem is a structural response." She looked back at the room. "I am not standing here tonight because I survived something difficult. I'm standing here because I refuse to accept that surviving something difficult was the end of the story." She held up the award. "This belongs to every founder who kept building when the system told them to stop. I'm just the person who finally had the resources to agree with them." She walked back to her table. Rachel was looking at her with an expression that said everything Rachel Monroe was too controlled to say out loud in public. Diane Cho said, "You didn't tell me you were going to say that. I didn't know I was going to say it," Claire said. "It was true," Diane said. "Yes," Claire said, "it was." The call she had not expected came 6 days after the gala. It came at 9:40 in the morning from a number she didn't recognize, and she almost didn't answer it. She was between meetings, walking back to her office with a coffee she hadn't had time to drink yet, and the unknown number registered as a probable misdial or a solicitation. She answered it anyway. The voice was male, formal, precise. "My name is Gregory Holt. I'm S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of North Carolina." Claire stopped walking. "I'm calling because you've been identified as a potential cooperating witness in a financial fraud proceeding. I want to be clear, you are not a subject of this proceeding. Based on a review of the evidence that was submitted through counsel last fall, and the subsequent cooperation agreement from Ms. Mercer, your role is that of a person with material knowledge of the underlying facts." A pause. "We'd like to speak with you." Claire stood in the hallway outside her office for a moment. She had known this call was coming. She had known it in the abstract. Rachel had told her months ago that the regulatory referrals she had made could eventually lead to a formal federal proceeding, and that if it did, she would likely be contacted. Knowing something abstractly and receiving the call were different experiences, and she let herself feel the difference for exactly the time it took her to reach her office door. Then she said, "I'll have my attorney contact you today to schedule." "That's fine," Gregory Holt said. "Miss Whitmore, I want to say something that's perhaps outside my usual scope. The quality of documentation that was submitted through counsel in this matter is exceptional. The evidentiary chain you built made our job significantly easier than it would otherwise have been." "I was a financial analyst," Claire said. "It's what I do." "Yes," Holt said. "We're aware of that now." He said goodbye. She walked into her office. She sat down. She called Rachel. "The U.S. Attorney's Office," Rachel said immediately, which meant she had already been contacted. "I got their call an hour ago. I was going to tell you at noon. What does it mean for Derek?" Rachel was quiet for a moment. "It means the investigation has moved from the regulatory level to the criminal level. It means Calvin Mercer's cooperation agreement is being used to build a case that is significantly more serious than a civil fraud claim." She paused. "It means Derek Whitmore is going to spend a very long time working with attorneys who are trying to manage an outcome that probably cannot fully managed." Claire absorbed that. "And me? You're a witness," Rachel said. "Your documentation is the backbone of the evidentiary case. You'll be deposed, you'll likely testify. Your credibility will be scrutinized and tested." Derek's defense team at every opportunity. Another pause. "Can you handle that?" "Yes," Claire said. "Are you sure?" "Because it's going to be public. It's going to be in the news. Your name is going to be connected to this proceeding every time it's covered." "Rachel," Claire said, "my name is already connected to this proceeding. The question is what the connection represents." She paused. "It represents the truth. I can handle that." Rachel said, "I know you can." 6 months after the gawk, Claire returned to Charlotte for the deposition. She had been back several times since leaving for the courtroom, for Rachel's office for 2 of the division's Carolina portfolio companies, but this felt different. This was the formal beginning of the legal process that would eventually resolve the things she had set in motion when she had circled Blue Cedar twice in red ink on a legal pad in an apartment that smelled like industrial cleaner. She arrived the evening before. She stayed in a hotel in Uptown, not the extended stay apartment, not the house that had been Derek's, just a hotel with a good bed and a quiet room, and the particular anonymity of a temporary place where she was responsible to no one and for nothing until the following morning. She ordered room service. She called her mother, who lived in Asheville, and who had spent the past year following the story in the news with the complex pride of a parent watching a child navigate something they themselves could not fully understand. "Are you all right?" her mother asked. "Yes," Claire said. "Are you sleeping? Better than I was. Are you eating?" "I'm eating right now," Claire said. "Room service. There's a very good risotto." Her mother laughed. It was a small laugh, the laugh of a woman in her late 60s who had watched her daughter disappear into a difficult marriage and was still processing the relief of watching her come out the other side. "I saw your speech," her mother said, "from the gala. Someone posted it. What did you think?" A pause. "I think your father would have been so proud of you," her mother said. Her voice was steady. "I think he always knew what you were capable of. He used to say you were the most precise thinker he'd ever met, and he'd met quite a few in his career." Claire sat with that for a moment. Her father had died 7 years into her marriage, early enough that he had seen what she was becoming inside it, late enough that he'd had the dignity not to say so directly. He had been a quiet man with an economist's mind, and a habit of looking at situations from every angle before committing to a conclusion. She had inherited both qualities. "Tell me about you," Claire said. "How's the garden?" Her mother talked about the garden for 20 minutes, and Claire listened, and it was one of the most storied 20 minutes she had spent in recent memory. The deposition lasted 2 days. Derek's defense team was thorough, aggressive, and deeply committed to the narrative that Claire Whitmore was a vindictive former spouse who had used a powerful employer to orchestrate harm. They returned to that narrative from every possible angle, testing it against each document, each timeline, each decision she had made from the moment she signed the divorce papers to the moment she submitted the evidentiary package through counsel. She answered every question the same way she had answered everything for the past year. Directly, specifically, without performance in either direction, no defensiveness, no satisfaction, no emotion that wasn't grounded in the actual content of what was being asked. On the second afternoon, Derek's lead defense attorney, a woman named Christine Adler, who was exceptionally good at her job, set down her pen and looked at Claire across the conference table. "Ms. Whitmore," she said, "I'm going to ask you a question that's outside the formal scope of this deposition, and you're under no obligation to answer it." Claire's own counsel, sitting beside her, said quietly, "You don't have to respond, I know," Claire said. "Ask." Christine Adler looked at her. "Why didn't you use any of this during the divorce settlement?" You could have. You had enough even then to change the outcome of the settlement significantly. Why did you walk away with nothing? The deposition room was quiet. Claire thought about the question. She thought about the conference room on the 41st floor, about Derek's hand on her wrist and the expression on his face and the sound of his attorney saying, finally, when she put the pen down. She thought about what she had known and what she had suspected and what she had needed not legally, not strategically, but personally before she could trust herself to act. Because I needed to understand what I was actually seeing before I put it in front of anyone, she said. And because I knew that if I used it immediately, when I was still inside the situation, I would be using it for the wrong reasons. She paused. Anger is not a reliable foundation for evidence. I needed to build something that would hold, that took time and distance and the resources to do it correctly. Christine Adler studied her. And the settlement itself, she said, leaving with nothing. I left with everything I actually built, Claire said. My own training, my own judgment, my own professional capacity. The rest was his. She paused. I didn't want anything that had his name on it. Christine Adler held her gaze for a long moment. Then she picked up her pen. Thank you, she said. She went back to the formal questions. The verdict came 14 months later. Claire was in Atlanta when Rachel called. It was a Tuesday morning and Claire was in a partners meeting reviewing the second-year performance of the division, and her phone lit up with Rachel's name and she excused herself from the room. She answered in the hallway. Guilty, Rachel said. On 7 of 9 counts, wire fraud, bank conspiracy to commit securities fraud. The jury deliberated for 4 days. Claire leaned against the wall. Derek, she said. Not a question, Derek, Rachel said. Calvin Mercer's sentence was handed down last week. Derek's sentencing is scheduled for 60 days out. She paused. Claire, it's done. Claire stood in the hallway for a moment with her phone against her ear. She tried to locate how she felt and found something she hadn't fully anticipated. She felt finished. Not triumphant, not vindicated in any way that resembled satisfaction. Just finished. The way a very long book felt when you closed the back cover and held it in your hands for a moment before setting it down. 11 years of a marriage, 14 months of a legal process. And now a Tuesday morning in a hallway outside a partners meeting, where the case that had defined the public narrative of her past 2 years had just resolved itself. And she had work to do. Thank you, Rachel, she said. That's it, Rachel said. That's your response? What do you want me to say? I don't know. Something, anything. You built the case that put him there. You deserve to feel something about it. Claire thought about that. I do feel something about it, she said. I feel like it's over. I feel like the thing I set in motion when I found blue cedar on that legal pad 2 years ago has reached its conclusion, and the conclusion is the right one, and now I can stop carrying it. She paused. That feels good, quietly, not loudly, but good. Rachel was quiet for a moment. Go finish your meeting, she said. I will, Claire said. And Claire, yes, you did good, Rachel said. I know I tell you the work did it, but you did the work. That's you. Claire held the phone for a moment after Rachel hung up. Then she straightened. She walked back into the partners' meeting. She pulled her chair in. She looked at the performance reports in front of her. Sorry for the interruption, she said. And she got back to work. 1 year after the division's founding, the numbers told a story that Claire found more satisfying than any award or any verdict. 11 companies in the portfolio. Combined revenue growth across the portfolio of 42% over the investment period. 3 companies that had received follow-on financing from other institutional investors after Kane Capital's initial investment validated the thesis. 2 companies that had been approached for acquisition at valuations significantly above their initial investments and whose founders had chosen to remain independent because they now had the resources to do so on their own terms. Diane Cho's groundwork had, as Claire had projected, ridden the regulatory compliance wave to triple its contracted revenue in 18 months. The loan officer who had rejected her application 3 times had called Diane's office in month 11, offering revised terms for a commercial line of credit. Diane had called Claire to relay the conversation. What did you say to him? Claire asked. I told him we had all the financing we needed. Thank you, Diane said. And then I told him that when he was evaluating his next female founder with a growth stage company, he might want to actually read the revenue contracts before deciding the projections were too aggressive. Good, Claire said. He seems surprised, Diane said. He'll get used to it, Claire said. The annual review meeting with Alexander ran 3 hours. He reviewed every investment with his characteristic thoroughness, asking hard questions, pressing assumptions, identifying two positions where he believed the portfolio concentration was higher than ideal, and requesting that Claire develop a mitigation strategy. She had already developed one. She presented it. He read it. "You anticipated this," he said. "I anticipated you would notice it," she said. He looked at her for a moment with something that, after 2 years, she had learned to recognize as the Alexander Kane version of warmth. It didn't look like most people's warmth. It looked like respect delivered at close range. "The second fund," he said. He slid a document across the table. "The board approved it this morning. $250 million. The mandate is yours." Claire looked at the document. $250 million. She thought about $3,000 in an accessible account, and a room that smelled like industrial cleaner, and a legal pad with 2 words circled twice in red ink. She thought about the distance between that moment and this one, and what lived in that distance: not luck, not rescue, not the beneficence of a powerful man who had decided to help her. Work, relentless, precise, unperformed work, the kind of work she had always been capable of, finally deployed on her own behalf in a context that rewarded it honestly. "I want to expand the geographic scope," she said. "Southeast first, then national," expected, Alexander said. "I want to add an operating partner with sector expertise in deep tech and advanced manufacturing. There are founders, no spaces, who fit the thesis, and I don't have the technical depth to evaluate them correctly without a specialist. Identify the candidates and bring them to me. I already have 3 in mind." He looked at her. "Of course you do," he said. He picked up his pen. She picked up hers. They both signed that evening. After the building had emptied and the city had settled into the particular quiet of an Atlanta night, Claire stood at the glass wall of her office and looked at the skyline. She had a habit in these quiet moments of taking an inventory, not of what she had the title, the fund, the companies, the professional recognition. Those things were real, and she was grateful for them, but gratitude for outcomes had never been her particular orientation. She took inventory of what she understood. She understood that the worst thing Derek had done to her was not the betrayal. It was not the hand on the wrist or the laughter in the conference room or the 11 years of credit taken and identity erased. The worst thing he had done was convince her, for a long stretch of time that still embarrassed her slightly when she examined it honestly, that her value was a derivative of his, that what she could see and think and build was only significant because of its proximity to him. She understood now that this was the most dangerous lie a person could be told. More dangerous than any fraud, any legal accusation, any public humiliation, because it operated from the inside. It didn't require external enforcement. Once a person believed it, they enforced it themselves. She had stopped enforcing it. That was the real story, not the private jet, not the courtroom entrance, not the verdict or the award or the $250 million fund. The real story was the moment she had stopped enforcing someone else's diminishment of herself. Everything after that was consequence. The door opened behind her. She turned. Alexander was standing in the doorway with 2 coffees, which was not something she had ever seen him do before. Alexander Kane did not typically arrive at a colleague's office in the evening carrying coffee. He was a man of precise professional habits, and this was outside them. She looked at him. He came in. He handed her one of the coffees. He stood beside her at the glass wall. "The second fund," he said. After a moment, "Yes? The board's expectation is that it will take 24 months to deploy fully. I can do it in 18, she said. He looked at her sideways. "I know," he said. They stood together in the quiet of the office, looking at the city. After a moment, Alexander said, "Derek probably still believes I'm the reason you're standing here." Claire looked at the skyline. "He'd be wrong," she said. "Significantly wrong," Alexander said. He looked at his coffee. "I opened a door. You had already been walking toward it for 11 years. She thought about that. "You didn't just open a door," she said. "You were the first person in 11 years who argued with my conclusions instead of ignoring them. That's not nothing." "No," he said, "but it's also not the reason you're a managing partner with a $250 million mandate." He looked at her. "That reason is you." Claire held at the city. She thought about a woman who had once stood in rooms like this and made herself small so that the man beside her could seem large, and she felt for that woman the particular compassion that only hindsight made possible, not pity, not anger, just the quiet recognition of a person who had been lost and had found her way back by the specific method of doing the work, one document at a time, one honest conclusion at a time, until the distance between who she was and who she had allowed herself to become had closed entirely. She had not taken half of Derek Whitmore's empire. She had done something that frightened him far more than that. She had built something of her own, something with her name on it, built on her own thinking, financed by her own credibility, and governed by her own judgment, something he could not claim, could not diminish, and could not touch. Because the most powerful thing Claire Whitmore had ever done was not the 87 pages of analysis or the negotiating table at 3 a.m. or the courthouse plaza in her stockinged feet. The most powerful thing she had ever done was refuse. She had refused to remain the woman Derek's version of her required her to be. And from that single refusal, quiet, unsigned, witnessed by no one, everything else had followed. She had signed away an empire and walked out with something worth more than any settlement. She had walked out with herself, and a woman who finally has herself back does not need anything that was ever taken from her. She already has everything she needs to build something the world has never seen before.